In 44 BC, Julius Caesar was killed, starting the bloodiest and final civil war of the late Roman Republic. 13 years later, in 31 BC, Caesar's adopted son and heir, Octavian, defeated Antony and Cleopatra and became the sole ruler of the Roman world. 4 years after that, in 27 BC, the Senate gave Octavian the title Augustus, officially recognizing his position, even though his power was clearly personal. For the first time in living memory, the civilized world could breathe and enjoy a long period of peace and stable government. The huge energy and creativity that once drove men like Sulla, Cicero, Pompey, and Caesar could now be used to build and improve the Roman Empire, with Rome at its center. One of the first places to benefit from this new era was the city of Rome itself. Augustus is famously known for saying, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble." In his autobiography, Res Gestae Divi Augusti, he listed the many public buildings he built or repaired. Even though this list does not include many important projects started by other officials or wealthy citizens, it is still very impressive. Since most of the architectural growth in imperial Rome happened within the framework Augustus created, any study of Roman imperial architecture must begin with the buildings of his time. We have plenty of information about this period. The records about construction in Rome between Caesar's death and Augustus's own death in AD 14 are almost too detailed when compared to the number of buildings that survive today. Studying all of them would mean listing buildings for which we often only know the date and reason for construction. Still, it is important to understand the general size and nature of this building program. One striking feature of Augustus-era architecture is its variety. This was partly because of the fast changes during that time, but also because of the different traditions inherited from the past and the wide range of patrons involved. It was such a large and ambitious program that it could only be completed by using all available resources. These influences can still be seen in the surviving buildings. Before examining the buildings themselves, we need to briefly look at the historical background. One major influence on early Augustus architecture came from Julius Caesar's unfinished plans and ideas. Caesar's vision was bold and wide-ranging. He wanted to completely reorganize the city. Augustus, through his ally Agrippa, followed through on many of Caesar's plans. Agrippa worked on the Campus Martius area, while Augustus redesigned the center of the Roman Forum. Caesar had first planned many important structures, including the Sciepta, the Theater of Marcellus, the Curia, Senate House, 2 basilicas in the Forum, and the speaker's platform called the Rostra. Caesar's use of a strong red pozzolana mortar transformed Roman building practices. He also likely began the large-scale use of Carrara marble, which was a major innovation. Augustus, with his steady and practical mind, understood Caesar's vision and carried much of it out. Another tradition Augustus continued was that victorious generals were expected to use part of their war spoils to fund public buildings. Many of the major works under Augustus and his successor Tiberius were financed this way. Right after Caesar's death, several buildings were also built by private citizens, either out of public spirit or political ambition. In a time when the patron's personal taste still played a big role, this led to a great mix of architectural styles. Some examples of private generosity include the Temple of Neptune in the Circus Flaminius, dedicated by Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 42 BC and probably built in 33 BC. The restoration of the ancient Temple of Diana on the Aventine Hill by Lucius Cornificius after 33 BC. The stone amphitheater built by Statilius Taurus in the Campus Martius, dedicated in 30 BC, the first stone amphitheater in Rome. the Porticus Philippi and Temple of Hercules Musarum, built by Lucius Marcius Philippus around 30 to 20 BC. The Atrium Libertatis with the first public library in Rome, built by Gaius Asinius Pollio after 39 BC. The Theatre of Balbus, dedicated in 13 BC, one of the last such private projects. Only a few of these buildings remain today, such as traces of the Theatre of Balbus and possibly parts of the Temple of Neptune. Some of their plans are known from the marble map of Rome made during the Severan period. Some buildings from Augustus' time have survived better. For example, the Temple of Saturn in the Roman Forum still has enough remains from a renovation in the early 20s BC, likely done by Lucius Munetius Plancus. Its columns show a unique design that combines old Republican styles with new marble materials. Another example is the Regia, the official home of the Pontifex Maximus, which was rebuilt in 36 BC after a fire by Cnaeus Domitius Calvinus. Its carvings suggest the stonemasons were not yet very skilled in working with marble. In contrast, the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill shows great craftsmanship. Its detailed carvings are very similar to those on a triumphal arch built in 19 BC to celebrate Augustus's diplomatic victory over the Parthians. This suggests both structures were built around the same time. The difference in quality between the Temple of Apollo and the Temple of the deified Julius shows how different styles existed even in this early stage. This variety is a key feature of Augustus-era architecture. After Augustus, the person most involved in building projects during the first part of the reign was his friend and partner, Marcus Agrippa. By 33 BC, Agrippa had already begun working on a program of public buildings, which he continued throughout his life. Most of his projects were practical and aimed at improving daily life. Under his leadership, Rome's entire sewer system was repaired. Flood walls were built along the Tiber River, and a new bridge called the Pons Agrippae was built. He also constructed a large warehouse, the Horea Agrippiana, near the river between the Forum Romanum and Forum Holatorium. He doubled Rome's water supply by repairing and expanding the existing 4 aqueducts. Later, 3 new aqueducts were added, either by him or by Augustus after his death: the Aqua Julia, Aqua Virgo, and Aqua Alciatina. Although most of Agrippa's works have not survived due to later repairs, they formed the foundation of all future infrastructure projects. One example from a slightly later stage is the arch of the Aqua Marcia aqueduct, which still stands where it crosses the Via Tiburtina. Rebuilt in AD 5, it was later incorporated into the city walls in the 3rd century. Made entirely of travertine, it follows traditional Republican building styles in its materials and details, but its shape, with framing pillars and a pediment around the arch, shows a new form of gateway architecture that would become common in imperial Rome. Agrippa's architectural projects were not limited to practical and functional works. In the flat area of the Campus Martius, he built a group of impressive public buildings. This included the Saepta, the Pantheon, the Basilica of Neptune, and the Baths of Agrippa. These structures were surrounded by gardens, covered walkways with columns, a canal, and an artificial lake. Sadly, most of this area was destroyed in a large fire in AD 80, and very little of Agrippa's original work survives today. The Saepta, finished in 26 BC, was a large open space surrounded by marble colonnades almost a mile long. The Pantheon, dedicated a year later in 25 BC, had foundations that were later reused in the Pantheon rebuilt under Hadrian. The original plan was similar to the Temple of Concord, with a narrow porch in front of a wider building. We know very little about the Basilica of Neptune, but since it was also called the Stoa of Poseidon, it was likely an open hall with many columns, like the old Republican basilicas. The baths supplied by the Aqua Virgo aqueduct were probably finished after 19 BC. Even with limited evidence, it's clear these baths were the first in a long line of grand public bathhouses that became a key part of Roman architecture. Agrippa's work in Rome reflects the larger building program of Augustus's early rule. His projects were based on practical needs and had a conservative style. Sewers were built using neatly cut stones, and aqueducts used Roman concrete with rough volcanic stones on the surface. The bridge over the Tiber River has not survived and was likely an early experiment using these materials that failed. For more ambitious works, we can look at Agrippa's monuments in the Campus Martius. The Septa, inherited from Caesar, was one of the first large-scale projects in Rome, possibly even the very first. We may never know if Caesar planned to use Carrara marble from the start, but Augustus's building efforts made such marble buildings possible by opening those quarries. By the 20s BC, the material was widely available. The Pantheon was at least partly built from marble. Pliny the Elder, a Roman writer, said the front of the Pantheon was decorated with caryatid statues made by the Athenian sculptor Diogenes. Athenian artists influenced many parts of Augustus's era, and the best example of this is in the Forum of Augustus, where we see classical Athenian details like caryatids inspired by those from the Erechtheion. With the Pantheon, we also have some information about the building process. One of Agrippa's few projects outside Rome was an Odeon in the Agora of Athens. It was a striking mix of Greek and Roman style. The materials and details showed Greek craftsmanship, while the building's bold design and large wooden roof, spanning more than 25 meters, showed Roman engineering. A Roman official named Appius Claudius Pulcher helped build the inner gateway at Eleusis, but he is not known to have built anything in Rome. Still, this kind of cultural exchange between Greek and Roman traditions was typical of the Augustan age. Some buildings that Augustus claimed to have built are listed in his Res Gestae, Deeds of the Divine Augustus, and parts of these still survive. While none are fully intact, ruins of major structures such as the Temple of the deified Julius, the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill, and the Mausoleum of Augustus give us a good idea of the architectural quality of the time. The theater of Marcellus has survived partly because it was turned into a fortress in the Middle Ages and later became a palace for the Savelli family in the 1500s. This theater was probably planned by Caesar, but not started in his lifetime. It was meant to be built on the site of an older theater temple complex from 179 BC. The theater was finally completed and dedicated between 13 and 11 BC. Its stage building is still buried underground, but the seating structure beneath the later palace is well preserved. After modern restoration, the curved front of the theater has become one of the most impressive monuments in Rome. The facade was made of 3 levels of arches framed by decorative columns, a style that comes from late Republican traditions. Compared to more complex designs with projecting and recessed sections like those in the temples at Praenesta and Tivoli, or the Tabularium in Rome, the Theater of Marcellus has a simpler layout. Even after later repairs, this simplicity remains clear. 2 key changes make this structure stand out. The entire facade was built of travertine, and the rhythm of solid and open spaces was bolder. It is usually assumed that the facade had 3 levels, like the later Colosseum. But only the lower 2 survive today, with Doric columns on the first level and Ionic columns on the second. Some researchers believe the missing top level might have been a plain attic wall, not a Corinthian level like in other classical buildings, similar to what is seen in the amphitheater at Pula. We know that there was an upper structure about as tall as the current palace walls, which helps explain why today's building still resembles the original Roman one. The remains of the seating and the complex substructure support this view. These lower parts were built partly with cut stone and partly with square-faced concrete blocks. The vaulted halls followed a radial layout and included smartly designed sloped ramps and circular corridors for people to enter and exit. Estimates show that the theater could seat about 11,000 people, arranged in 3 rising levels. The top level was definitely made of wood. The outer hallway was covered with radial barrel vaults, each matching a front arch, and rested on strong horizontal beams. This design helped support the outward pressure from the upper seating. The outer galleries and front structure didn't just manage large crowds, they also worked as a massive support system. This shows how Roman architects turned engineering problems into practical solutions. Even though the theater of Marcellus was based on earlier Republican monuments from Latium, it pointed forward to great engineering works, like the Colosseum. The theater of Marcellus represents a strong Republican tradition that managed to survive into the age of Augustus with very little outside influence. This tradition wasn't about copying foreign styles, but about finding practical solutions to new needs. On the opposite end of this architectural spectrum stands the Ara Pacis Augustae, or the Altar of Augustan Peace. This monument stood on the west side of the Via Flaminia, just north of Agrippa's buildings. It was planned in 13 BC and dedicated 4 years later. It was built on a low platform, almost square in shape, with a smaller stepped altar in the center. The entire structure was made of Carrara marble. Its sculpted details, symbolic figure panels, a long procession frieze, acanthus scrolls, and garlands are among the finest examples of Roman sculpture. There was no Roman tradition behind this design. The marble was new, and the decorations show the hand of Greek craftsmen. Even the altar's plan seems inspired by the Altar of Mercy in the Athenian Agora. Still, the monument's message was fully Roman. It shows a real event, a procession that happened on July 4th, 13 BC, not an idealized scene. The figure reliefs here are the first true examples of architectural sculpture in Rome, a major Roman contribution to classical art. No other time in Roman history showed such a creative blend of different cultural traditions as the age of Augustus. The traditional style of the theater of Marcellus and the Hellenistic influence of the Ara Pacis represent two opposite tastes in Augustan architecture. The combination of these two trends formed the core of the most powerful and influential buildings from this period and shortly afterward. One of the best examples of this mixture is the Forum of Augustus, the peak of Augustus's building program. The Temple of Mars altar inside the Forum, like the Temple of Venus Genetrix in Caesar's Forum, stood at the end of the central space. It was promised after the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, but when the Forum opened in 2 BC, it was still not fully finished. Most of the work on the Forum and Temple happened during this later phase, and they represent the mature style of Augustan architecture. The Forum of Augustus, like Caesar's earlier Forum, aimed to provide more public space for a growing city population. Its plan followed Caesar's Forum, but was more developed and compact. The temple stood at the end of a rectangular open area, with long colonnades on each side. At the ends of these colonnades were two semicircular courts, aligned with the temple front. Today, these side halls are destroyed, and half of the Forum lies beneath a modern road, which makes its proportions look unusual. But originally, the temple had an almost square plan and a deep porch. It sat on a tall platform, reached by 17 steps, and rose dramatically along a long, narrow corridor. The writer Suetonius said Augustus could not buy all the land he wanted for the Forum, likely referring to the eastern corner. The resulting asymmetry was cleverly hidden using the side colonnades. Even though there are many Hellenistic details, the basic design of the temple is Roman. Placing the temple on a high podium and having it fill the back of the rectangular space are features of Italian tradition. The strict alignment of the buildings along a central axis is also Roman. A Greek architect might have designed the site to match the natural slope. Roman architects usually treated monuments as freestanding structures, and in this case, the 35-meter-high wall around the temple made this effect even stronger. This wall worked as a fire barrier and separated the forum visually from the crowded Subura neighborhood. The height of the colonnades added to the enclosed feeling. Above the rows of columns on the facades were sculpted bands with caryatids holding up the friezes, surrounded by medallions showing gods' heads. Inside the semicircular courts, there was likely a contrast in style. These spaces were probably functional, used for legal hearings, and their design may have come from the lack of space in the eastern part. This kind of cross-axis design was a typical Roman feature, later developed further in Trajan's Forum. The Forum's concept, purpose, and layout were all distinctly Roman, but in its details, it introduced many new and exciting ideas. The outer walls, made with alternating blocks of Gabine stone and travertine, show fine craftsmanship from the late Republic. Meanwhile, the temple's elegant marble walls had a base of large slabs topped with a carved meander frieze, clearly Greek in origin, probably from Asia Minor. These elements resemble the Temple of Augustus in Ankara and show the architect also knew Attic monuments like the inner propylaea at Eleusis. Similar designs are seen in the Forum's caryatids and in the Pegasus-decorated capitals inside the temple. The craftsmen working on the Forum were likely Greek, as the marble columns, friezes, floors, and wall panels show expert work. The marble came not only from Carrara, but also from colorful varieties imported from Numidia, Phrygia, Teos, Chios, and Euboea. This was the first time such expensive marble was used so widely and generously. The contrast between the bright white temple and the colorful surroundings was bold and original. Pliny the Elder named this forum one of the 3 most beautiful buildings in the world, alongside the Basilica Aemilia and the Temple of Peace, built by Vespasian due to its rich marble decoration. Sadly, we know little about the temple's interior because it was badly damaged in the Middle Ages by marble burners. But the inside must have been richly decorated. The apse held statues of Mars, Venus, and the deified Julius Caesar. The roof was supported by 2 rows of columns, with pilasters on the walls behind them. A column base recorded during the Renaissance is very similar to those in the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill, showing another traditional link between forum and temple. These influences had not yet blended into a single Augustan style, and probably never did fully merge. But they quickly formed a rich set of styles and designs that Roman architects could draw from. No other time in Roman history saw such a strong and wide acceptance of new styles and ideas as the age of Augustus. Almost every monument in the Roman Forum is linked to Augustus in some way. But most of this work involved finishing or restoring projects begun by Julius Caesar. The 4 main buildings Augustus completed in this way were the Basilicas Aemilia and Julia, the Senate House, and the Rostra. These were part of Caesar's plan to bring order to what had been a messy and irregular area in the city center. The 5th structure, the Temple of the deified Julius, was dedicated in 29 BC, but was probably mostly finished earlier. It added a strong architectural accent at the southeast end of the open space, across from the rostra and between the 2 basilicas, completing Caesar's layout. The rostra, or speakers' platforms, were more historically important than architecturally. The Curia from Augustus's time was badly damaged in a fire in AD 284 and had to be rebuilt completely by Emperor Diocletian. Coin images show that the new version looked a lot like the old one. It had a tall, flat front with 3 rectangular windows, a triangular pediment, and a shallow porch stretching across the front. We have enough information about the 2 basilicas to get a clear idea of how they looked. Although they were similar in location, layout, and function, they show the variety of architectural styles used in Augustus's Rome. The more traditional of the 2 was the Basilica Aemilia. After a fire in 14 BC, it was rebuilt, mostly following the original plan. It had a long, narrow main hall lit from above and surrounded on all sides by a portico with inner galleries. This hall was about 90 meters long and 27 meters wide, and it opened to the southeast. On the northeast side, there was an extra row of columns near the wall. These were probably decorative, not structural. The design was conservative, but it stood out because of the rich materials and decorations. On the southeast, facing the Forum, were the Tabernae Novae, which were likely 2-story shops opening into a 2-story portico. This portico had arches supported by piers, placed in Doric-style frames that projected outward. It was known as the Portico of Gaius and Lucius, dedicated in 2 BC, and functioned as an independent structure. It was a Roman version of a Hellenistic stoa and designed to match the facade of the nearby Basilica Julia. The Basilica Julia was destroyed by a fire shortly after it was completed in 12 BC and had to be completely rebuilt by AD 12. This building offers a contrast. Inside the main hall were centumviral courts, which could be separated by curtains or wooden dividers. This setup was closer to the Republican style, with 3 open sides and only the southwest side enclosed. That side contained 2-story shops or offices, opening onto the outer portico and the gallery above. Even though it looked similar to Basilica Aemilia, with a central hall surrounded by double porticos and galleries, it was built with a very different technique. Instead of columns, arches rested on rectangular piers, and the porticos were covered with barrel vaults. Only the main hall had a wooden roof. The inner piers were cross-shaped and made of travertine, while the outer piers were solid marble. The main arches on both facades were placed between 2 levels of Tuscan half-columns and moldings. Though built with richer materials, its support system was very similar to that of the theater of Marcellus. It was a unique example of how the traditional basilica type was reimagined using new techniques. Temple architecture in Augustus's time was usually conservative. Limited space in the city didn't allow the bold experiments seen in the large rural sanctuaries of late Republican Latium. During Augustus's reign and under his successors, Roman temples were still placed against back walls, raised on high platforms, and faced forward, features of old Italic design. But overall, there was a move toward a more Greek Hellenistic style. Many old temples with short columns and wide roofs were still standing. But when they burned or were restored, they were rebuilt in the newer Hellenistic proportions and details. One of the earliest and finest temples of the Augustan age was the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill, built between 36 and 28 BC. It was made entirely of Carrara marble and decorated with many famous statues. It was seen as a wonder of its time. Beside the temple was a portico supported by Numidian marble columns and 2 libraries, one Greek and one Latin. After the Great Fire of AD 64, the libraries were rebuilt by Domitian on higher ground. Their remains can still be seen behind the grand dining hall of the Flavian Palace. From the temple itself, only the core of its foundation platform and a few marble pieces survive above ground today. excavations show that it had a pseudo-peripteral plan. A wide, six-columned porch stood above a grand staircase, facing the Circus Maximus. Augustus's house stood on one side of the temple, and a courtyard with the two libraries stood on the other. What we know about these early Augustan buildings shows that they were part of a lively period of architectural experimentation. If more of these structures had survived, we would have a clearer picture of how Augustan architecture evolved over time. Near this temple stood the Temple of Magna Mater, which provides a strong contrast. After a fire in AD 3, Augustus had it restored in a completely conservative style. Likely, the original Republican temple's stone parts were reused. The walls and details had a lot of plasterwork. A 1st century relief found at Villa Medici, showing the front of an Augustan temple, gives us a rare look at this now lost plaster craftsmanship. The pattern of the stonework in the relief looks very similar to that of the Temple of Mars altar. In such a busy time for building, it's likely that other conservative restorations were done as well. Of the 82 temples Augustus claimed to have restored in 28 BC, many were probably rebuilt with traditional materials and layouts. Even when restoration meant full reconstruction, the new buildings often looked old-fashioned. A striking example is the 3 small temples at the Forum Holitorium, partly preserved in the medieval church of St. Nicola in Carcere. These temples were long thought to be from the Republican period. Some even dated to the 2nd century BC, because of their materials and design. But we now believe that at least the Doric temple made of travertine, and likely all 3, were built in Augustus's time to replace temples destroyed in the Great Fire of 31 BC. The 2 nearly identical Ionic temples seem based on the design of the later Temple of Castor. One may be the Temple of Janus, which was likely only rededicated in AD 17. Given the pressure on resources and labor, it's not surprising that these small temples were delayed or built with old-fashioned styles. 2 more important temples from Augustus's time are the temples of Castor and Concordia. Both stood near the Roman Forum and were completely rebuilt during Augustus's last 20 years. The Temple of Castor was rebuilt by Tiberius by AD 6 and was a large peripteral structure. It stood on a double platform that rose steeply from the forum floor, like the temple of the deified Julius, and may have served as a speaker's platform. The main base was made of concrete surrounded by tuff blocks, with travertine bases under the columns. The entire building was faced with Carrara marble. Between the columns were niches, possibly used as treasury rooms. The 3 standing columns today are 14.2 meters tall and still hold part of the original entablature. They are made of Carrara marble and were already famous as a landmark by the 15th century. Most of the inner cella is gone, but we know it had decorative columns along the interior walls, like in the Temple of Mars altar. Some scholars have suggested that the upper parts were added in the 1st or 2nd century AD, but this is incorrect. Though different from the Temple of Mars altar in many ways, it still shows typical Augustan features. The Temple of Castor seems to follow Greek models less closely than Mars altar. The Temple of Concordia was also rebuilt by Tiberius and dedicated in AD 10. It stood on the same site as the earlier version and kept its unusual layout. The cella was wider than it was deep, and the porch only covered part of the front. This temple stood out for its fine marble and rich sculptures and paintings. Even though most of this decoration is now lost, the surviving parts show how richly it was adorned and how it anticipated the grand styles of the Julio-Claudian era. Some of the remains include a richly carved cornice, a column base from the interior, and a Corinthian capital with carved ram's heads instead of regular scrolls. The doorway threshold was made of Chios marble and other marbles from Euboea, Phrygia, and Numidia were used in the floor and wall coverings inside. For people who know the fine details of Greek temple design, one big question comes up. Can we make general comments about the plans, column spacing, or proportions of temples from the time of Augustus? This is a fair question even for thinkers like Vitruvius, who represented architectural theory at the time. But since the style of the era was very mixed and technical skill often mattered more than strict design rules, answers to this question would not always satisfy Vitruvius or his peers. Temple layouts during Augustus's reign were not very uniform. There were many different models to choose from, and architects came from different backgrounds with different tastes and training. For example, the Temple of Concordia had a special layout. The temples of Diana and Quirinus had 8 columns at the front and 2 rows of columns on the sides. The temples of Mars and another one were open at the back. Vitruvius called these sine postico. Most other temples had 6 columns and were either fronted with columns, had a false peripteral plan, or were fully peripteral. In general, temples became taller in proportion. A good example is the Temple of Mars Ultor, which had 8 columns in front but only 9 on the sides. This height effect was made stronger by using tall podiums. Some temples, like those of Julius and Castor, even had double podiums. The Temple of Castor, for example, stood over 30 meters tall from ground level to the top. These height-focused designs clearly had an impact on later buildings, like the temples at Lepsis Magna and Sabratha. Although the 3 temples at the Forum Holatorium are not fully from the Augustan period, most Augustan temples, except maybe Saturn, Julius, and Palatine Apollo, used the Corinthian order. This became the standard in Roman architecture. Columns were often placed close together. This may have helped with both structure and the appearance of greater height. In the 3 major temples, Divus Julius, Castor, and Mars Ultor, there were rich decorative columns inside the walls of the cella. These were beautiful but also useful because they helped support the roof by narrowing the open span. While this idea came from Greek temples, similar examples existed in Roman buildings from the Republic, like the apsidal hall at Praeneste or Cicero's Nymphaeum at Formia. This design was first used in the Temple of Venus Victrix by Pompey and became a common feature after Augustus. House architecture of this period will be discussed in another section, but we should note that rich Romans started to build new types of villas in the countryside. Funerary architecture also became more imaginative and experimental. A key example is Augustus's own mausoleum in the Campus Martius. It was built near the Tiber in 28 BC and ready to use by 23 BC. Though it is now in ruins, we can still understand its main shape. It was a huge concrete cylinder, 88 meters wide, covered in travertine. A mound of earth was placed on top, with a bronze statue of Augustus at the peak. Inside were 4 concrete rings, lined with travertine or tuff, and arranged to support the earth. In the center was the burial room. Monumental family tombs like this were common among Roman nobles. 2 other examples from this time are the Mausoleum of Caecilia Metella on the Appian Way and the tomb of Munerius Plancus at Gaeta. The top of the mound was planted with evergreen trees, and the area around the mausoleum had a grove of trees and a family cremation area. Though the landscape no longer survives, ancient writings show this kind of garden design was popular and considered part of the overall plan. Another nearby structure from this period was Agrippa's set of buildings, south of the mausoleum. Agrippa was one of the first to be buried there. In terms of building techniques, the Augustan period didn't bring sudden new inventions, but it did show steady improvement of existing methods. Good quality stones like travertine and Gabine stone were used only in visible parts. Lower quality stones were used in foundations or hidden walls. When dating a structure, especially like the Forum Holatorium temples, we must be careful, because rules for public buildings didn't always apply to private ones or buildings outside Rome. Concrete became more common as a cheap and efficient material, so cut stone was used only for special, important places. Great examples of cut stone work from this time include the Theatre of Marcellus, the outer wall of the Forum of Augustus, and the base of the Temple of Castor. Though there were no huge breakthroughs in concrete, its quality improved a lot. In late Republican buildings, horizontal lines often show where concrete was poured in stages. By the end of the 1st century BC, this was less common. Builders now used slow-drying mixtures that hardened as one solid mass. Arches and vaults also changed. Earlier stones were laid radially inside the vaults, but now they were placed in horizontal layers. After the wooden mold was removed, the vault had to stand on the strength of the concrete alone. Most importantly, Roman builders discovered that local red volcanic sand worked just as well as the special sand imported from Puteoli for making strong concrete in harbors and bridges. When mixed with lime, this local pozzolana gave Roman concrete its famous durability. Although they didn't know the science behind it, Vitruvius wrote that by the 20s BC, builders had gained a lot of experience with different kinds of mortar. Studies show that pozzolana was first used widely during Caesar's time, but it became common in everyday construction under Augustus. Different types of concrete facings also developed during this period. These changes help archaeologists date buildings. For example, close study of Agrippa's aqueduct repairs shows that different builders used slightly different methods, even on the same project. So we shouldn't expect perfect uniformity. By the early Augustan period, squared stone facing with tough blocks at the corners had replaced earlier, messier types and stayed popular for the next century. The most important innovation was the occasional use of brick. Starting in the mid-1st century BC, bricks began appearing cautiously in monuments. In Augustus's time, most bricks were broken or shaped roof tiles. Vitruvius, writing around 25 to 22 BC, mentioned that bricks were used in apartment buildings. Just 25 years later, a tomb for Augustus's freedmen was built with a full brick facade. Around 20 BC, the Rostra Augusti shows one of the first uses of brick in a public building. Brick had the great advantage of reducing or removing the need for vertical wooden molds. Though the full benefits of brick were realized only after Augustus, these developments, together with better concrete, paved the way for future architectural breakthroughs. When we look at all the building activity in Rome between Caesar's death in 44 BC and Augustus's death in AD 14, it's hard to see a single unified architectural style. And that reflects reality. Augustan architecture, like Roman architecture in the next 300 years, developed in a wide variety of ways, often quite different and unexpected. Only by studying it in historical context can we see the shared features and understand the direction Roman architecture was heading. The main reason behind the large building program in the time of Augustus was the historical situation. After years of war, peace, and prosperity returned to the world. This led to an extraordinary wave of construction. Since Rome had become the clear center and ruler of the civilized world, all its resources, skills, materials, and artists became available to the city. What is surprising is not that Augustus's buildings included foreign elements, but how quickly and effectively these were adapted to Roman use. Even more important in the long run was how Roman culture started to influence other areas in return. Just like Republican Italian architecture cannot be understood without the Hellenistic world, now for the first time, the arts of the Hellenistic East began to change because they were part of a bigger structure. the Roman Empire. One major reason for this transformation was the strength of local Italic traditions. These traditions already had clear Hellenistic and even Greek elements, especially in places like Campania, where history had brought these cultures together. But over time, these elements had been naturally absorbed and adapted to local needs. One key feature of this Italic style was the full use of arches for both structure and decoration. Columns and beams, which were central in Greek architecture, became secondary or decorative. Another feature was the replacement of wooden roofs with vaulted ceilings. Many temples survive from this time, but civil buildings, which best reflect local traditions, are mostly lost. Buildings like the Theater of Marcellus and the Basilica Julia form a line of development from Republican sanctuaries and the Tabularium to the Colosseum and Domitian's Stadium. These buildings represent many now lost administrative and commercial structures. Another special part of Italic architecture was the creation of new building types that responded to local needs. The basilica is a good example. Campania, with its mixed Greek and Italian population, played a big role in shaping these new forms. Although decorated with exotic materials, the Basilica Aemilia in Augustus's time was just as Roman as the Basilica Julia, only more traditional in its details. Even temples that at first appear Greek in style often show, on closer inspection, that they only look Greek on the surface. The core structure had already been adapted to Roman use. What was new were the materials and decoration. As far as we know, no building from the Augustan period, especially after the early years, was as openly Greek as the small circular temple from the Republic in the Forum Boarium. The strongest and most original parts of Republican architecture were tied to the use of local building stones in central Italy. In contrast, the Greek influence on Augustus's Rome was closely connected to the wide use of marble, a foreign material. Before, marble had been a luxury import. But once the Carrara quarries opened, large amounts of marble came to Rome. To work it, many skilled craftsmen were brought from Greece, where marble carving was still a living tradition. Romans admired Greek art, so the decorative traditions of the Republic were quickly reshaped in a Hellenistic style. These sculptors were trained in Attica's neoclassical schools and brought their own motifs. What's surprising is not that these new decorations appeared, but how fast they were accepted and adjusted to Roman taste. From a Greek perspective, the proportions and details of these buildings might seem strange or incorrect. But judging them by Greek rules is a mistake. This was a brand new Roman style. In just a few decades, a unique Roman decorative language appeared and would dominate architecture in the capital for the next 100 years. Compared to this, importing colored marble for columns, floors, and wall panels seems less revolutionary. Using many colors in architecture was already known. This was just a richer and more refined version. The real importance was that these new materials helped separate decoration from the building's structure even more clearly. This trend had started in the Republic, but it only became fully developed during the Empire with the use of brick-covered concrete buildings. Looking at Augustan architecture from the view of people who lived at the time, we see a mix of grandeur, cautious conservatism, and respect for recent Roman traditions. The biggest changes in style happened in decoration, but the size, quality, and variety of the Augustan building program became a source of endless inspiration for later architects. These buildings were seen as authoritative because of the time in which they were built. Also, this period served as a kind of school where future builders learned to use materials skillfully. Just like in other areas, the real importance of Augustus's rule in architecture is that it laid the foundation for the future. Even though many different influences were active, the architecture of Augustan Rome still showed a clear sense of unity in both space and time. This gave the city a sense of visual and organizational simplicity. Later periods also kept some of this unity, but to a lesser degree. Except for areas like Spain and Gaul, most provinces developed their architecture independently and can be studied separately. Inside Italy, things were more complex. While Campania remained somewhat creative, ideas mostly flowed from Rome to the rest of Italy. Throughout the 1st century, Rome stayed the main center that set architectural trends. That's why it makes sense to begin with public buildings in the capital and nearby areas. Also, since emperors had direct influence over buildings made during their reigns, it's helpful to look at architecture by reign. 2 topics need a more detailed study and will be discussed in separate sections. One is house architecture in cities and the countryside. The other is the major mental shift in architecture between Nero's rise and Hadrian's death, what we can call the Roman Architectural Revolution. Very few buildings were built in Rome during the reign of Augustus's successor, Tiberius. While Augustus was alive, Tiberius helped build 2 grand temples, those of Castor and Concordia. After Augustus died, he finished some projects that had been left incomplete. After more than 50 years of busy building, a break may have been welcomed. Also, in his later years, Tiberius became more distant and moved to Capri, which likely ended any focus on beautifying Rome. Most of Tiberius's buildings in Rome were built in the early years of his reign. Some small temples dedicated in AD 17 were actually restorations of older buildings started during Augustus's time. In AD 16, a triumphal arch was built in the Forum Romanum to celebrate Germanicus's victories. 2 more arches were added in AD 19 in the Forum of Augustus, honoring Germanicus and young Drusus. Though little remains of these, they show the decorative style of the Julio-Claudian period. The same is true for the Basilica Aemilia, which was restored in AD 22 with major improvements to its upper level. We know nothing about the granaries built by Sejanus, and we must look to Ostia for examples of this type. Likewise, nothing remains of the rebuilt stage building of Pompey's theater after the AD 21 fire. However, the historian Tacitus mentioned it as one of only 2 public buildings of Tiberius's reign, meaning it was likely an important project rebuilt with better materials and colored marble. The second building mentioned by Tacitus was the Temple of Divus Augustus, built after Augustus was declared a god. Tiberius likely supported this temple for political and family reasons. He almost completed it before he died in AD 37, but it was opened by his successor, Caligula. The temple stood in an area south of the Basilica Julia, which is still unexcavated. We have no physical remains, but some coins from Caligula's time show a 6-columned Ionic temple, which many believe to be this building. Others think these coins actually show the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill, and that the real Divus Augustus temple appears on another coin series from AD 34 to 37, usually linked to the Temple of Concordia. However, since the Concordia temple was already dedicated in AD 12, it's unclear why it would be shown again 25 years later. The Ionic style seen on the coin fits more with Augustus's early preferences than with the tastes of the older Tiberius. More archaeology is needed to settle this question. For now, while the traditional view is widely accepted, it still has some problems. From both a political and architectural view, the most important surviving building from Tiberius's reign is the Praetorian Guard Camp. It was built between AD 21 and 23 under the command of Sejanus, Tiberius's powerful advisor. Until then, the Praetorians were spread across the city. This building brought them together for the first time. Although it stood just outside the city, it showed the move toward full autocratic power. Architecturally, it was a turning point. This was the first time a military camp design, common in the provinces, was used in Rome. Its outer walls were later included in the Aurelian Wall, and it is one of the first large public buildings made almost entirely of brick-faced concrete. The plan of the camp was a rounded rectangle, 430 by 371 meters, covering more than 14 acres. It followed the standard layout of a Roman military camp, divided unevenly along the short axis and evenly along the long axis, with 4 main gates. The design of the gates used a typical stone layout now built in brick. Like the Arch of Augustus in Rimini, the archways were framed with decorative piers and topped with pediments. Next to the gates were small square towers sticking out 30 centimeters from the wall, and similar towers repeated along the length of the wall. The outer wall sat on a 3-step base with a horizontal band 2.90 meters tall. Above this was a 1.2-meter railing and small, spaced-out battlements. The inner buildings, such as barracks, used a different stone technique called opus reticulatum. Given the new construction method, the outer wall's clean design is impressive. The building was designed not only to be functional for military use, but also to look powerful. The gate decorations introduced a simple but effective brick style that would become important in Roman architecture. Another building from this transition period was the new palace that Tiberius built on the Palatine Hill. Excavations show that Augustus's palace was more notable for its connection to the nearby Temple of Apollo than for size or luxury. After becoming emperor, Tiberius began building a larger residence called the Domus Tiberiana at the northwest corner of the hill. It was built on an 18 by 12 meter platform. Much of it is now under the Farnese Gardens from the 1500s. Some parts of the building used brick surfaces, while others used the reticulated stone pattern. A round fish pond in the southeast corner shows that the shape of the palace was not perfectly rectangular. However, most of what we see today, including the side facing the Roman Forum, belongs to later emperors. This suggests that construction may have stopped when Tiberius left Rome. To understand how Tiberius and the Julio-Claudian emperors lived, we need to look at villas outside Rome, such as on the island of Capri or near Albano. Caligula, whose real name was Gaius, ruled for a short time and had a wild personality. Because of this, he didn't leave a big mark on Roman architecture. He had plans to change the Palatine Hill and expand the Domus Tiberiana toward the Forum, but only a few remains of these projects exist today. Some ruins near the later Santa Maria Antiqua church show a courtyard with arches and a central pool. On a higher level, there is a large vaulted water tank where light materials like tuff and pumice were used to make the vault lighter. Caligula started building 2 new aqueducts but didn't finish them. He also wanted to replace the end of the Aqua Virgo aqueduct with an amphitheater. But this was never built. In the Vatican area, he had a hippodrome built, which later became infamous under Nero for Christian persecutions. Next to it was the Gaianum, used for chariot training. These places are more important for their location than for what was built there. Caligula brought an obelisk from Egypt to decorate the hippodrome. This obelisk still stands in St. Peter's Square today. Caligula's list of public buildings is quite short. Even if we include the buildings he completed after Tiberius, his achievements are not impressive. But 2 areas of architecture under Caligula are more important. First is private housing. Writers like Suetonius and Pliny mention that Caligula built many villas outside of Rome. These houses surrounded the city and were very luxurious. Over time, they became imperial property. Caligula hosted a Jewish delegation from Alexandria in one of these gardens, which was described in detail by Philo. Although nothing survives from these buildings, the 2 large ships built for Caligula on Lake Nemi give us clues. These ships were like floating palaces, decorated with water systems, marble floors, mosaics, ivory doors, bronze tiles, and sculptures. The style of these ships is very similar to the luxury found later in Nero's palaces. It shows that Caligula's taste influenced Roman domestic architecture. Another area where Caligula showed personal taste was in religious buildings. Even though Augustus had already rebuilt many temples for traditional gods, people at the time were more drawn to mystery religions from the East. These religions promised comfort in this life and hope in the afterlife, like Christianity. They included the cults of Cybele, Isis, Mithras, and even philosophical groups like the Neo-Pythagoreans. Some of these groups were accepted by the state and built large temples. Others, like early Christians, avoided public buildings and met in private homes. Some went underground, literally. One example is the underground basilica near Via Praestina. Built for a Neo-Pythagorean group in the mid-1st century AD, it was later closed and buried. Its basilica-style plan was later copied by Christians. The building was carved out of tough rock, and its construction shows Roman creativity with materials. Other cults accepted state rules but kept their identity. A major example was the cult of Isis and Serapis. Caligula was interested in these Egyptian gods, and a temple to them was built in the Campus Martius. Though damaged in later fires, parts were rebuilt by later emperors. The temple had a courtyard with 2 shrines, one of them possibly with a curved shape. Inside, it followed Egyptian style, with statues brought from Egypt. Some of these are now in museums, and 2 small obelisks still stand in Rome. Egyptian influence in Roman decoration was popular. It could be seen in large obelisks placed around the city, and in wall paintings showing the Nile. This style didn't come just from Egyptian cults. Artists from Alexandria and the Hellenistic world also shaped this taste. A famous example is the Barberini mosaic from Palestrina. These temples in the Campus Martius marked a shift toward Eastern-style art and belief. Claudius was very different from Caligula. He was older, serious, and practical. He didn't care for grand or expensive buildings. Some large gardens became imperial property during his reign, but no new major structures were built there. He did make small additions to the Palatine Hill and built a new altar for Livia, Augustus's wife, modeled after the Ara Pacis. He did not rebuild the Temple of Felicitas after it burned down. Claudius built 2 triumphal arches to celebrate military victories, but these were not unusual by that time. Coins show their design: twin columns on a base, an architrave, and an attic above. One had a triangular top, the other a flat one, and both may have carried statues of the emperor. One of his most important projects was completing 2 aqueducts started by Caligula, Aqua Claudia and Aqua Anio Novus. He also repaired the Aqua Virgo. These were built using peperino stone with travertine for details. A famous gate, Porta Maggiore, was built where 2 aqueducts crossed major roads. This gate is still one of the best surviving examples of Claudius's architecture. The aqueducts outside Rome used concrete with poor quality work. Contractors under Claudius had a bad reputation for corruption. However, Claudius made huge contributions in public engineering. 2 big projects were building a new harbor near Ostia and draining Lake Fucino. Roman engineers learned a lot from these efforts. The lake project involved digging a tunnel to connect the lake to the Liris River. It took 11 years to complete and showed how Roman builders relied on practical knowledge. For example, they mistakenly used red sand from the lakebed because it looked like volcanic pozzolana, even though better sand was nearby. Still, they knew how to use the real pozzolana in harbors. This mix of skill and trial and error laid the foundation for later architectural breakthroughs. One of the main goals of the new harbor at Ostia was to ensure a steady supply of grain. Because of this, Emperor Claudius took a strong interest in storing and distributing grain. Many grain warehouses were located directly in Ostia. In Rome, similar buildings are rare today, probably because they were simple structures that left fewer remains and are harder to date. However, along the west side of the Via Lata, under the Palazzo Doria and nearby, there are remains of a large colonnaded building. For a long time, people thought it belonged to the Septa, but it is now believed to be the Porticus Minutia Frumentaria. This building seems to have been a major grain distribution center in Rome at the time. Some arches under the Church of St. Mary in Via Lata were built from rough travertine blocks, a style typical of Claudius's time. The columns were freestanding and held up simple arches. The presence of cross-shaped hidden columns shows that the roof was vaulted. If this building was indeed the Porticus Minutia, as inscriptions suggest, it had at least 42 entrances or offices. It likely had multiple floors used for storing grain, with ramps for access, similar to the warehouses in Ostia. Another commercial building, thought to be from the Claudian period, is found under the Church of San Clemente. It is the eastern one of two ancient buildings there. It had a rectangular courtyard surrounded on three sides by small rooms with narrow doorways. The fourth side and the entrance are now lost. The narrow entrances suggest that the goods stored here were smaller than grain. The presence of windows might indicate that this building was used both as a storehouse and a market. After Claudius died, his wife Agrippina, who may also have been responsible for his death, began building a large temple and sacred area in his memory. The remains of this site were later added to Nero's Golden House gardens and finished by Emperor Vespasian. The use of carefully worked, rustic travertine stone at the site is very similar to Claudius's work on the Aqua Virgo and Porta Maggiore. The style is quite different from Nero's more elegant architecture, suggesting that this was a final tribute to Claudius and his building legacy. When Nero became emperor after his stepfather Claudius, he was only 17 years old. He had artistic interests and some talent, but was mentally unstable and unsuited to handle the powers of an emperor. Two events made his reign a turning point in Roman architecture. The first was the Great Fire of AD 64, which destroyed much of the city, comparable in impact to the Great Fire of London in 1666. The second was the recent progress in building techniques and materials. Although there was no single leading architect like Christopher Wren, the building practices of the time had the potential to create something entirely new in architecture. All that was needed was a reason and a push. Nero and the fire provided both. The architectural changes that followed were first seen in Nero's buildings. These projects reflected a new way of building and thinking about design. They also reveal Nero's personality. At the beginning of his reign, Nero acted like a rich young aristocrat. He completed the circus in the Vatican area, started by Caligula, and built a new bridge over the Tiber, the Pons Neronianus. He also ordered the construction of a temporary stadium in the Campus Martius, which may have later become the Stadium of Domitian. In AD 57, he built a lavish temporary amphitheater decorated with marble, gemstones, ivory, golden nets, and star-patterned awnings, very much in line with the man who later built the Golden House. In AD 59, he also built the Macellum Magnum, a large market on the Palatine Hill. Although it has not survived, artwork suggests it had a two-story pavilion leading into a courtyard with colonnades, making it a grander version of earlier single-story markets in cities like Pompeii. Nero's most popular building was likely the public bath complex he built, around AD 62 or 64 in the Campus Martius, near the aging Baths of Agrippa. These baths were called the Thermae Neronianae. The poet Martial once joked, "What's worse than Nero? What's better than Nero's baths?" The baths were fully restored in AD 227 by Alexander Severus and were made symmetrical like later imperial baths built by Titus, Trajan, and Caracalla. Sadly, we don't know which parts of the complex were Nero's original work, so we can't say for sure if they marked the beginning of the imperial-style baths that became standard later. Next to the baths, Nero also built a gymnasium, showing an early example of public baths being used for social and educational purposes, something that became common in later centuries. Nero inherited a city house near the Via Sacra from his father. This might have inspired the idea of the Domus Transitoria, a palace meant to connect imperial estates on the Esquiline and Palatine Hills. Its central room was a small, possibly domed circular space, later incorporated into the foundation of Hadrian's Temple of Venus and Rome. This room was at the crossing of two vaulted corridors. In some sections, shallow marble pools were hidden behind columns. The floors were decorated with colorful marbles and glass mosaics in geometric patterns. Besides the fine materials, the design of the space, with curved rooms connected by vaulted corridors, was one of the earliest examples of a new architectural style. This style, with complex interlocking curved spaces, would be fully realized in the later Golden House. Another well-preserved part of the Domus Transitoria lies under the dining hall of the Flavian Palace. This was a sunken courtyard with fountains, placed in a valley between two spurs of the Palatine Hill. The central court had a fountain wall on one side and a columned pavilion on a raised platform on the other. At each end of the court, there were rooms decorated with marble, wall panels, painted ceilings, colored glass, and plaster inlays with semi-precious stones. This peaceful area was meant for dining and relaxing outdoors in summer. In function and layout, it resembles Renaissance garden courtyards, like those built by Ammanati in the villa of Pope Julius. Its theatrical fountains and small pavilions match the designs seen in Pompeian wall paintings. The stones used came from Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, and Africa, and some were used in Rome for the first time here. The craftsmanship was also advanced. For example, air gaps were built into the walls to prevent moisture damage, and special floor insulation was installed. In AD 64, a massive fire broke out near the Circus Maximus and spread across the Palatine, Caelian, and Esquiline hills. It destroyed the Domus Transitoria and many of the city's oldest and most crowded neighborhoods. Rome was divided into 14 regions. 3 were completely destroyed, and only 4 were left untouched. With full imperial power at his disposal, unlike Wren in London, Nero acted quickly. He used the opportunity to build a new and more ambitious palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. He took over neighboring properties through forced acquisition. The estate covered about 300 to 350 acres, roughly the size of Hyde Park, or 1/3 of Central Park in New York. At its center was a low-lying area that would later become the site of the Colosseum. Though the idea of this massive palace was controversial, it was a unique and deeply personal creation, marking a true turning point in Roman architectural history. At its core, the Golden House was a luxurious countryside villa, but located in the heart of the city. The real problem, according to Nero's contemporaries, wasn't the luxury itself, but the fact that it took up urban space. This idea shaped the layout of the palace. A man-made lake, located where the Colosseum now stands, was the centerpiece. The main residence looked over the lake from the sheltered slopes of the Ulpian Hill, a spur of the Esquiline. streams from specially built aqueducts flowed down into the area. Around the lake and its parklands were scattered fountains, baths, colonnades, pavilions, and small temples. From the palace terrace, the surrounding city was hidden from view. Only toward the Roman Forum, along the Velia Ridge, were monuments constructed. The fire had destroyed the Temple of Vesta and everything south of it, so Nero built a grand entrance hall on that site, later replaced by the Temple of Venus and Rome. At its center stood a giant bronze statue of himself, 120 feet tall and covered in gold. From the western slope of the Velia, the traditional path of the Via Sacra was rerouted and turned into a ceremonial avenue lined with colonnades. After Nero's death, almost all the buildings from his massive palace complex were removed. The only lasting effect of his construction was that it cleared space in the city, allowing later emperors to build many of Rome's most famous monuments. Structures like the Temple of Peace, the Temple of Venus and Rome, the Colosseum, the Baths of Titus and Trajan, and the Flavian Palace were all built in this area. Only the residential wing of Nero's Golden House survived long enough to be included in the foundations of the Baths of Trajan. This part was preserved and rediscovered during the Renaissance by artists and antiquarians. The underground, vaulted rooms became known as grottos, which inspired the art style called grotesque. Today, the word still carries the name of this style, reminding us, strangely but fittingly, of the admiration this unusual imperial project once inspired. The people living in Nero's time did not fully understand the importance of the architectural changes happening around them. To them, the Golden House seemed more like an engineering wonder full of strange inventions. Nero preferred extravagant and eye-catching designs, and the architects Severus and Celer were highly skilled engineers. They had previously worked on grand projects like the attempt to dig a canal from Lake Avernus to the Tiber River. With such experience, they were able to create wonders like an artificial lake, a rotating dining room that showed the movement of the stars, ceilings that scattered perfumes and flowers, and baths supplied by seawater and hot springs from near Tivoli. They designed and built this enormous palace and its landscape in just a few years. One of them may have been a visionary who realized the artistic potential of the new concrete material. But ancient sources do not mention this side of their work. Today, Nero is still best known for the Golden House, and he probably would have liked that. But he also deserves credit for the smart urban planning he introduced after the Great Fire of Rome. His new plan replaced narrow, twisting streets with wide, straight avenues. These streets were lined with colonnades that allowed firefighters to reach rooftops easily. No building was allowed to be taller than 70 feet. Each house had to be built separately from the others to prevent fires from spreading. The use of wood was limited, and fireproof materials were encouraged. Of course, people did not always follow these rules. Still, if we look at the well-organized streets and apartment blocks of 2nd century Ostia, which modeled itself on Rome, we can see how influential these rules were. Nero's building codes provided a legal framework for changes that were already beginning. The old, crowded, and decaying apartment buildings of Rome were gradually replaced by more orderly and solid concrete structures. The Great Fire gave Rome the chance to rebuild, and Nero played a major role in shaping this new version of the city. After the chaos of the civil war that followed Nero's death, a new dynasty came to power, the Flavians. They were from a solid middle-class background in central Italy. The founder, Vespasian, was a capable general and a smart administrator. He brought with him the strengths and limitations of his humble origins. When he became emperor, the imperial treasury was empty. But over his 10-year reign, he managed to refill it through careful spending and strong financial policies. Vespasian did not build large monuments just to show off. Every building project he started had a clear purpose. That is why, even though his list of works is short, each structure has great architectural meaning. One urgent task was to rebuild the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Palatine Hill, which had burned down during the Civil War. The temple was rededicated in AD 75, but burned again 5 years later. Nothing of Vespasian's version survives today. However, written sources and coins from that time suggest it followed a traditional design, much like its predecessor from the late Republic. It may have been slightly taller and used more high-quality marble, but it kept the same overall layout and even repeated the feature of Jupiter's 4-horse chariot on the roof. Vespasian also made a smart political move by finishing the temple of the deified Claudius, Claudianum, which had been left incomplete and partly dismantled by Nero. By doing so, he honored the Julio-Claudian dynasty, gaining legitimacy while also distancing himself from Nero's unpopular rule. The original structure likely only left behind the large platform on top of the Caelian Hill, about 200 by 160 meters. Vespasian added a wide staircase facing north toward the Colosseum and 2 rows of travertine arches on the western side facing the Palatine Hill. These remains are now on the grounds of the Passionist Monastery and were recently fully excavated. The decorative pool on the eastern side, originally built by Nero, was left in place. The western facade was built in 2 levels using rustic stonework. The lower level had rectangular openings with flat arches and a cornice supported by simple Doric pilasters. The upper level had rounded arches, framed by more pilasters, and topped by a bold projecting cornice. The keystones of the arches stood out, and the stonework was only finely carved in certain areas like the capitals, cornices, and upper architrave. Most of the surface was roughly finished with deep grooves that only hinted at architectural patterns. The wall surfaces between the arches were filled in, creating a solid facade. The ground floor had brick-faced concrete walls with doorways to shops, while the upper rooms had rectangular windows framed in rustic travertine. Still, the most dominant feature was the rhythmic series of arches forming a strong visual presence facing the Palatine. Although finely crafted, this design clearly echoed the Temple of Jupiter Anxur in Terracina and could be seen as its direct descendant. Nothing remains of the actual temple, but its layout is known from a marble map of Rome made during the time of Septimius Severus. It was a 6-column temple with a front portico placed on a high podium slightly east of the platform's center and oriented westward. The surrounding space had trees or bushes and was at least partly enclosed by shaded colonnades. The surviving travertine platform and architectural style suggest the temple was built during Vespasian's reign. It was placed on the core of an earlier, simpler platform and overlooked a paved street, which didn't fit the garden landscape of Nero's Golden House. The masonry style closely resembles work from Claudius's time, like what we see at Porta Maggiore and Aqua Virgo. This might mean that some elements from the original project were reused. Another important Flavian monument was the Temple of Peace, often called the Forum of Vespasian, not entirely accurately. Dedicated in AD 71 after the capture of Jerusalem, it was designed to present the new dynasty as a bringer of peace, much like Augustus had done with his altar of peace. The complex was a rectangular area about 110 by 135 meters, aligned with Augustus's forum. The 2 areas were separated by a busy street called the Argiletum, which connected the Roman Forum to the crowded Subura district. Most of the area was a large garden surrounded on 3 sides by colonnades made of red Egyptian granite. The 4th side, facing the Argiletum, had no portico. Instead, it featured a row of tall columns made of Africano marble attached directly to the entrance wall. Pairs of similar columns decorated the 4 square exedrae along the colonnades. The temple itself faced northwest, along the short axis. Instead of standing out into the garden space, it was aligned with the southeast colonnade. Its front portico covered the entire length of the colonnade, and its curved apse extended toward the rising slope of the Velia Hill. On either side of the temple were large rooms accessible from the portico. One served as a library, and the other later housed the famous marble map of Rome from the Severan era. Several features of the layout stand out. The use of the short axis and the way plants were used to highlight the building lines were similar to the Claudianum. The square side chambers resembled the temple area at Baalbek, or the later Hadrian Library in Athens. The columned row facing the northwest wall may have been the earliest example of using this type of interior decoration on the exterior of a building. The most unusual aspect was the temple's relationship to its courtyard. Unlike most Roman temples, this one did not dominate the space. Instead, it was part of a calm and balanced design. The sacred area, known in Greek as the Temenos Irenes, drew its power not only from rich materials and decorations, but also from its simplicity and harmony between architecture and nature. It displayed war treasures like the 7-branched menorah and the Ark of the Covenant taken from Jerusalem, alongside masterpieces of Greek art. The writer Pliny called it one of the 3 most beautiful buildings in Rome. Unaffected by the innovative architectural styles of the time, the Temple of Peace was one of the last and most beautiful examples of conservative Roman architecture. The Flavian Amphitheater, better known today as the Colosseum, is one of the greatest wonders of its time. Since the Middle Ages, it has symbolized the glory and endurance of Rome. The famous lines that Lord Byron translated from the Venerable Bede come to mind. As long as the Colosseum stands, Rome shall stand. When the Colosseum falls, Rome will fall. When Rome falls, the world will fall. Because of this reputation, it is hard to look at the building without emotion or bias. Even the name Colosseum, although fitting, was not used in ancient texts and probably came from the nearby giant statue of Nero, known as the Colossus. At the time, other amphitheaters in Rome had problems. The one built by Taurus had recently been damaged by fire, and those by Caligula and Nero were only temporary and couldn't handle the city's growing population. Building a large, permanent amphitheater was a smart move for the new Flavian dynasty to gain public support. Choosing the site of Nero's artificial lake was equally clever. It erased a symbol of Nero's excesses and turned it into a gift for the people. The valley was perfectly located, already excavated, had good drainage, and had strong clay soil to support the massive structure. Construction likely began early in Vespasian's reign and wasn't finished until after his death. Whether parts were done by Vespasian, Titus, or Domitian doesn't matter much. The key point is that the anonymous architect managed the whole massive project with clear vision and skill from the very beginning. The biggest challenge was how to manage a large crowd, estimated at 45,000 to 55,000 people, and guide them in and out in an orderly way. Though the scale was new, the basic design had been tested before. The solution used in the theater of Marcellus, inspired by the older theater of Pompey, became the standard model for amphitheaters across the Roman world, especially those built on flat ground. The seating was built on top of wedge-shaped vaulted rooms and passageways that radiated outward and upward. Staircases and ramps were placed in these spaces, allowing direct access to every wedge of seats, called cunae, and the curved rows within them. The Colosseum had 76 numbered entrances, and wooden barriers could control the flow of people. The outer ring of corridors both managed movement and helped hold the pressure from the seating areas. These were familiar techniques to Roman architects. What was new were the engineering challenges caused by the enormous size of the building. The Colosseum was elliptical, about 188 by 156 meters on the outside and 86 by 54 meters on the inside. The seating ring, or cavea, was 51 meters wide and reached a height of 48.5 meters from the ground to the top. The lower seating levels were made of marble and supported by vaulted structures. The upper levels were made of wood to reduce weight. At that height, the only thing holding the structure was the thickness and strength of the outer walls. The inner corridors and vaults below were strong enough to balance the pressure. The central entrances on the long sides led directly to the emperor's box and the senators' seats. The true importance of the building lies in its materials and construction techniques. Like in the best Roman buildings, the foundations were carefully prepared. A giant elliptical concrete ring, 51 meters wide and 12 meters deep, was poured to support the seating. The lower part was set into a trench dug into the hard clay. The upper part was encased in brick-faced concrete, equipped with drains and service areas, and topped with large travertine blocks. From this platform rose the vertical support columns, also made of travertine from Tivoli. These columns formed the main framework up to the second level of vaults. The radial walls between them were made of cut tufa stone on the lower levels and brick-faced concrete higher up. One of the inner corridors even featured an early example of ribbed barrel vaulting, a technique that didn't add much strength but helped with the building process and became more common in later Roman architecture. Using different materials not only saved money but also sped up construction. Each material was handled by different craftsmen. After the travertine frame was built, they added the tufa and concrete, then the wooden parts and marble seats. The project was divided into 4 or more sectors so that work could happen at the same time. On the top facade, we can still see the marks of at least 2 teams working simultaneously. In such a well-planned project, it's likely this method was used for the entire building. Architecturally, the travertine facade doesn't show many new ideas. It followed the traditional style with 3 tiers: Doric columns at the bottom, Ionic in the middle, and Corinthian at the top. These half columns and entablatures were mostly decorative. The top level had a large upper wall supported by tall Corinthian pilasters. The 3 levels framed rows of arches leading to the walkway corridors. Small rectangular windows were added to light the upper corridors. Aside from the grand marble entrances with statues placed at the 4 main directions, the rest of the facade was uniform. These features were all traditional. The architect's real success was in handling such a large mass with balanced proportions and making smart adjustments to the column orders to suit the internal layout. 2 features stand out. The large bronze decorative shields placed between the upper windows and the tent system, or velarium, used to shade the crowd. A special group of sailors managed this tent. The poles rested on 3 large brackets just below the top entablature and were anchored using stone bollards at the base of the seating. Since the marble inside was taken during the Middle Ages, we know little about the interior. Some granite columns found high up may have supported a roof above the top wooden seating area. Most of the underground service tunnels and rooms belonged to Domitian's time. These included elevators that used counterweights to lift scenery or animals onto the arena floor. A similar system existed in the amphitheater at Puteoli in Campania, offering a good comparison. The Colosseum was not a radical design. Its methods, materials, and overall form were traditional. It belonged to a line of Roman architecture going back to the Republic, with similarities to buildings like the Temple at Praeneste or the Tabularium. In many ways, it was the final grand example of this older style. just before newer techniques and ideas took over. But this traditional style could still produce powerful, majestic buildings. In the Colosseum, the bold planning and technical skill of Rome's best architectural period reached their peak. Titus, the eldest son and successor of Vespasian, did not live long enough to leave a strong personal mark on Roman architecture. Besides continuing work on the Colosseum, he started only two major projects: the temple of the deified Vespasian and a new public bath complex called the Baths of Titus. He was also honored with a triumphal arch, likely the three-arched structure at the curved end of the Circus Maximus. Another arch, now known as the Arch of Titus on the Via Sacra, between the Roman Forum and the Colosseum, may have also been begun during his reign. For the Temple of Vespasian, a site at the foot of the Palatine Hill, next to the Temple of Concord, was chosen. Due to limited space, the stairs were placed between the front columns. The temple followed the traditional six-columned design with surrounding colonnades. Even though it was built quite late, the podium was left in plain travertine, while the inner room, probably finished under Domitian, was richly decorated with expensive marble. The three surviving columns today are part of a careful restoration done in 1811 by Valadier. A preserved section of the upper entablature under the tabularium is one of the best examples of Flavian architectural decoration. Bold, deeply carved, and richly adorned. This decorative style developed gradually in Rome from the late Augustan era, through the Julio-Claudian and Flavian periods, into the early years of Trajan's reign. The Baths of Titus were built quickly to be ready for the Colosseum's dedication in AD 80. Like his father, Titus chose to build on the land once part of Nero's Golden House, near the former palace and facing the valley. Almost nothing remains except some brick-faced concrete and attached columns across from the Colosseum. However, we know the layout thanks to Palladio's measured drawings. While the details are debated, the drawing suggests that the whole complex was built using brick-faced concrete. Palladio's plan clearly shows that the bathhouse followed the typical imperial-type layout. This type, developed over time, featured a large rectangular space with a centrally placed bath block arranged symmetrically along its short axis. At the north end was the frigidarium, a tall hall with three ribbed vaults and small side chambers with cold water pools. At the south end, usually sticking out to catch sunlight, was the caldarium, the hot bath. The north side also had changing rooms, exercise areas, toilets, and service rooms. The south side had 2 rows of small heated rooms. Water tanks were placed around the outer edge, and social rooms like libraries, classrooms, museums, and meeting halls opened onto large gardens from this ring. This layout became the full form of the imperial bath type. Titus's baths were smaller than later complexes, and the outer area was mostly a large terrace on the south. Still, most key elements were already in place. It's possible, though not proven, that this layout had been used earlier in Nero's baths. In any case, the roots of this important architectural model for later Roman buildings lie in the productive middle years of the 1st century AD. Domitian, Vespasian's younger son, became emperor after Titus died in AD 81. He ruled for 15 years and built extensively. While his architecture was not revolutionary, it showed steady progress and left a strong mark on Roman architecture during a critical time. Skilled architects like Rabirius, one of the few Roman architects whose name we know, worked under him. Domitian rightly deserves to be counted among the great builder emperors of Rome. His construction projects fall into 3 categories: buildings inherited from his father and brother, repairs after the Great Fire of AD 80, and completely new projects he started himself, some of which were left unfinished when he died. The first group includes the Colosseum, the Baths of Titus, and the Temple of Vespasian, already discussed. The famous arch at the beginning of the Via Sacra may also have been started under Titus, but was finished as a grand monument after his death. It was built with a concrete core and covered in Pentelic marble. The arch is known for its dignified design and 2 relief panels showing scenes from the Jewish War. It also includes one of the earliest uses of the composite capital, which was becoming common in public monuments. It was the first major Roman building made from imported white marble since the Republic. In the Middle Ages, the Frangipane family turned it into a fortress, and its current look comes from Valladier's 1821 restoration, which used travertine to show the difference between original and rebuilt parts, an early example of scientific restoration. The Great Fire of AD 80 damaged many buildings between the Capitoline and the Pantheon, including both new and old monuments. Among them were the recently rebuilt Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, and Agrippa's monumental complex in the Campus Martius. Almost all of these damaged buildings were restored by Domitian. A few traces survive, like in the Temple of Veovis near the Tabularium, where he replaced the wooden roof with a concrete vault and decorated the interior with colorful marble. The Temple of Jupiter was also restored in traditional style, with features like gilded bronze roof tiles and golden doors. This version lasted until late antiquity, but almost no physical evidence of Domitian's work remains today. Domitian's original projects show a wide range of scale and style. On one end was the vast Flavian Palace. On the other was the stadium in the Campus Martius. Today's Piazza Navona still follows the shape of this stadium, and some surrounding buildings include parts of the original seating structure. The stadium was designed like a 2-level version of the Colosseum, but adapted for races. Marble seating was built over travertine and brick-faced concrete. The outer wall had travertine arches framed by classical architectural orders. This stadium is the last known major Roman structure to use travertine cut stone on a monumental scale. Many buildings constructed between major projects like the Flavian Palace and the stadium still followed traditional Roman monumental architecture, but they introduced new ideas that would influence future Roman design. One such example is the Porticus Divorum, which no longer survives above ground, but is known from a marble map created during Septimius Severus's reign. It was a long rectangular space dedicated to the deified emperors Vespasian and Titus. Domitian may also have used it as a place for gathering during victory parades. One end featured a grand 3-arched triumphal gate, while the other end had an altar. Inside, next to the central arch, were 2 small 4-columned temples facing each other. Long colonnades ran along the sides and the back. While its proportions were different from the Temple of Peace, it shared features like planned tree planting, symmetrical extensions with porticos, a unified design instead of highlighting individual temples, and high walls that shut out the outside world. This last feature shows 2 trends in early imperial temple architecture. In the Roman Forum, emperors continued placing temples within the urban landscape. But starting in the late Republic, especially with buildings like the Porticus Metelli, a tradition began of surrounding temples with colonnaded courtyards. This became clearer in the imperial fora. The high walls were probably added for fire safety, but they also reflected increased contact between Rome and the Hellenistic East, particularly Syria and Egypt, regions where sacred areas were closed off and inward-facing. In the East, this tradition continued during the Roman period, while in the West, it highlighted a key feature of Roman design: formal structure. Roman architects were not blindly attached to symmetry, but they did avoid unclear or irregular layouts. Unlike Greek architects who relied on intuition, Roman builders preferred clearly defined, solvable problems, things that could be drawn and measured. Another major focus of Domitian's building program was the imperial fora. He built the Forum Transitorium, later dedicated by Emperor Nerva. Domitian also worked in the Forum of Caesar and the area that would later become Trajan's Forum. According to the historian Eusebius, the site for Trajan's Forum originally belonged to Domitian. Located next to the Forum of Augustus, Domitian even cut into the lower slopes of the Quirinal Hill to prepare the area for construction. However, the final design and execution were entirely different and credited to Trajan and his architect, Apollodorus of Damascus. We'll never know exactly what Domitian had planned for this space. Another related project was the rebuilding of the Temple of Venus Genetrix in Caesar's Forum. It was rededicated in AD 113, the same year Trajan opened his new forum. While it's not certain, some scholars believe Domitian began the reconstruction, based on the rich Flavian-style decoration of the upper parts. But this could also reflect the continued use of older styles by artisans trained under the Flavians. Also, the area had been damaged in the Great Fire of AD 80, so it's likely the repair work began under Domitian and was completed under Trajan, with the reopening timed to match the inauguration of Trajan's Forum. The new temple kept much of the earlier design and reused the old podium. This platform rose directly from the ground, with access via small stairs on either side. The temple itself was short in depth compared to its width and had very closely spaced columns, 8 across the front and 8 on each side. 3 of these columns were re-erected in the 1930s. The temple's columns and upper parts were made from Luni marble. Inside the apse, decorative Numidian marble columns stood on ornate bases. One detail in the inner wall decoration was a carved pattern that imitated fluted stonework using chiseled grooves. Domitian, the younger son of Vespasian, became emperor in AD 81 after his brother Titus died. He ruled for 15 years and launched many construction projects. His architectural work was not revolutionary, but through its scale and timing, it left a strong mark on the development of Roman architecture during a critical period. Skilled architects like Rabirius, one of the few Roman names known today, played an active role in his projects. Because of this, Domitian is rightly remembered as one of Rome's great builder emperors. Domitian's building activity can be grouped into 3 types: projects he inherited from his father or brother, buildings he repaired after the AD 80 fire, and entirely new structures he began, some of which he did not live to finish. The first group includes the Colosseum, the Baths of Titus, and the Temple of Vespasian, all already discussed. The famous arch at the start of the Via Sacra was likely started under Titus, but completed as a full monument after his death. This arch had a concrete core faced with Pentelic marble and stood out for its elegant design, and 2 reliefs showing the victory in Jerusalem. It was one of the earliest public monuments to use the composite capital style, developed by Augustan architects, and the first major Roman structure built with imported white marble since the Republic. In the Middle Ages, it was turned into a fortress by the Frangipani family, and its present form dates to an 1821 restoration by Valadier. His method of using travertine to show which parts were restored was an early and successful example of scientific restoration. The Great Fire of AD 80 damaged many buildings from the Capitoline Hill to the Pantheon, including the recently rebuilt Temple of Jupiter and Agrippa's monumental complex in the Campus Martius. Almost all of these were restored by Domitian. The marble map from Septimius Severus's time gives us clues about some of these, like the Temple of Isis and Agrippa's baths, though little remains today. One exception is the small Republican-era Temple of Veovis, near the Tabularium. In its restoration, Domitian replaced the wooden roof with a fire-resistant concrete vault and decorated the interior with colorful marbles. The Temple of Jupiter was rebuilt in traditional form, with gold-plated bronze roof tiles and gilded doors. This version lasted into late antiquity, though very little remains of Domitian's own contributions. Domitian's original buildings varied greatly in size and style. On one end was the massive Flavian Palace, on the other, the stadium in the Campus Martius. Today's Piazza Navona still follows the size of that racetrack, and nearby buildings contain remains of the seating structures. The stadium was basically a two-story version of the Colosseum, adapted for races. The marble seating rows were supported by foundations of travertine and brick-faced concrete. The official section of Domitian's palace was a long rectangular block, with three main state halls opening directly onto its front. Behind these rooms was a large courtyard with a fountain and a formal garden, surrounded by columns, and this led to the grand banquet hall, the triclinium. The three state rooms from west to east were a basilica where the emperor held court, a central audience hall often called the Aula Regia or throne room, and a small temple-like space called the Lararium, used for worship. The basilica was a large rectangular room with an apse at the end. Two rows of Numidian marble columns, set about 2 meters from the side walls, helped support the ceiling, which was likely covered with a coffered vault. This type of layout had roots in earlier Roman structures like vaulted nymphia. Soon after construction, part of the outer wall began to settle, and the northwest corner had to be reinforced with buttresses during Hadrian's reign. The audience hall in the middle may or may not have had a vaulted roof. It was larger than the basilica, and although the walls were solid and supported, there is doubt whether they could carry the full weight. The walls were divided by rectangular projections that held niches, or aediculae, decorated with sculptures. Each section was framed by richly decorated Phrygian marble columns. At the southern end was a shallow apse with the emperor's throne. The lararium was smaller, and while it should have been structurally simple, the later addition of supports by Hadrian suggests that the architect Rabirius may have underestimated the load. Instead of a grand staircase in front, the facade had a long portico that stretched across it and partly along the west side. This connected the staterooms with the Clivus Palatinus and the older Domus Tiberiana. Behind the staterooms was a large courtyard with a fountain and formal garden, surrounded on all sides by columned galleries. On the south side of the courtyard was the triclinium, or imperial banquet hall, almost as large as the audience hall. It likely had a wooden roof. Facing the courtyard, it had 6 large Egyptian granite columns placed behind an 8-column portico. At the back of the room was a platform and apse, where the emperor and guests sat. Granite columns also supported the roof along the side walls. Between these columns were pairs of doors and large windows opening into 2 smaller courtyards, each with fountains. These had porticos on only 3 sides and open ends. At their centers were large oval fountains carved with elegant curves and sculpture. Domitian's private quarters were built on a steep slope facing the Circus Maximus. Because of the slope, the upper floor of this wing matched the ground level of the official wing. The main entrance was at street level, and the curving shape of the courtyard wall was mirrored by the outer wall and portico. This design gave guests a view of gardens and marble pools from almost every position. Later, during Hadrian's reign, a hypocaust system was added to ensure comfort in all seasons. It opened at the center of the sloping southern portico and led into a rectangular hall that connected to a central square courtyard. The courtyard was likely supported by arches rather than columns on both levels. a layout also seen in later Roman apartment buildings in Ostia. In the center was a curved fountain shaped by combining 4 pelta forms, richly decorated with sculptures. On the east and west sides were small rooms around skylights and stairways to the upper level, some on split levels. On the north side, cut into the slope, were 3 triangular domed rooms, some of the most famous parts of the building. The upper floor was more complex, with most rooms facing the inner courtyard. On the north, there were 2 sets of intricate rooms, one inward-facing, the other outward-facing. Because of the slope, this outer area was already at upper level and formed the main architectural link between the private and public wings. This private section shows the architect's creative use of space and how Roman design had evolved in the 20 years since Nero's Golden House. This theme is discussed further in the next section. To the east of the private wing was a sunken garden, shaped like a stadium. It was about 160 meters long and 50 meters wide. Instead of a starting gate, the north end had 5 vaulted rooms. At the south end was a rounded curve with fountains symbolizing turning points. 3 sides of the garden were lined with 2-story porticos, the lower with brick arches, the upper likely with columns. A large vaulted exedra in the center of the east side suggests that the space was also used for events. At the southern end, a viewing box facing the Circus Maximus gave the emperor a view of the races. This entire complex was unfinished at Domitian's death and completed by Hadrian with some changes. Flavian stonework east of the site suggests Domitian had further plans here, possibly a bath complex where Septimius Severus would later build his own. The aqueduct serving this area was a branch of Nero's Aqua Claudia and dates from Domitian's time. To the north, a large platform stretched across the northern edge of the palace, holding the Ides Caesarum, a temple dedicated to Augustus and other deified emperors. This would later become the Sun Temple of Elagabalus. The layout of the platform was finalized under Domitian. It shaped the route of the Clivus Palatinus and defined the palace's northern boundary, used with great architectural skill. Domitian also rebuilt 2 libraries of Augustus that had been damaged in the Great Fire of AD 64. They were behind the triclinium, near the palace corner. Additional buildings added along the slope included the pedagogium and barracks for imperial messengers, completing the southern face of the palace. Altogether, these scattered parts show the detailed planning and skill with which Domitian and his architect, Rabirius, turned the entire Palatine Hill into a unified architectural masterpiece. The monumental vestibule leading from the Forum to the palace was one of Domitian's final works, later finished by Hadrian. It replaced an older building, possibly part of Caligula's Domus Tiberiana. The new vestibule had 3 main parts. A massive hall, once mistaken for the Temple of Augustus, now understood to face the Temple of Castor. A structure later turned into the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua, probably a guard post, and a triple ramp zigzagging up the slope to the Domus Tiberiana. The reception hall was a huge brick-faced concrete building measuring 33 by 24 meters, with a ceiling starting 18 meters above the floor. The west portico was replaced under Hadrian with a row of buttresses, probably a fix for structural problems. Inside, the walls were plain, but decorated with alternating rectangular and curved niches. The entry doors were placed off-center, matching the niche layout. This design choice likely served both a practical purpose and an aesthetic one, making the visitor suddenly enter a vast, empty hall without warning. Apart from the throne room, this was the largest enclosed space in the palace, holding about 20,000 cubic meters. Lit from above by large windows at either end, it created a powerful, awe-inspiring effect. Domitian died in AD 96. His successor Nerva made only one major architectural contribution, dedicating the forum started by Domitian under his own name. But his most lasting act was choosing Trajan as his heir, launching a new dynasty that would bring lasting peace and prosperity for nearly a century. Trajan, the first emperor from a Roman provincial family, was a capable and well-rounded leader. The buildings constructed during his reign were not very innovative in form, but they showed impressive scale and planning, bringing to completion the vision Augustus had started a century earlier. Though late antiquity praised Trajan as a great builder and restorer, written sources don't fully reflect this. For example, we have no records of his reconstruction of the House of the Vestal Virgins in the Roman Forum. Yet brick stamps show it was rebuilt during his first decade. The rebuilding of Caesar's Forum and the Temple of Venus Genetrix also likely occurred under him, though sources are silent. Despite these gaps, Trajan's work can be grouped into three major efforts: the massive Baths of Trajan on the Esquiline Hill, engineering projects improving ports in Ostia and Rome, and the building of a monumental new forum, basilica, libraries, and market north of the Roman Forum. Part of the area chosen for the construction of Trajan's new buildings was the northeast section near the Baths of Titus. It also included the main residential wing of Nero's Domus Aurea, which meant that this grand structure was completely removed just 40 years after its construction. Luckily, the new buildings were planned at a slightly different angle, allowing more sunlight to reach the area in the afternoon, which was helpful for bath times in Rome. The most important monument that Trajan built with the spoils of the Dacian Wars was his Forum, dedicated in 113 AD. It reflected the architectural style of his time and was very complex in both layout and design. To create a level area about 200 meters long and 120 meters wide, engineers had to cut deep into the ridge between the Quirinal and Capitoline hills, up to 38 meters deep. A large column, the Trajan's Column, was built to mark this achievement and matched the depth with a height of 38 meters. Around 60% of the platform was used for the open forum and the two side porticos. The outer walls of the porticos had large semicircular spaces called exedras. The design of the porticos, with round decorative medallions and statues of Dacian prisoners, was inspired by Augustus's Forum. The curved entrance wall took inspiration from another forum, the Forum Transitorium. The entrance featured a grand gateway topped with a chariot pulled by 6 horses, as seen on Roman coins. In the center of the forum stood a huge equestrian statue of Trajan. Along the portico roofs were golden horse statues and military standards, along with many other sculptures made of colorful marble, all celebrating Trajan's victories. Despite its grandeur, the forum was not overwhelming. It had harmonious proportions and a balanced, functional design. When Emperor Constantius II visited Rome in 357, he was most impressed by this forum. Unlike earlier imperial forums, the fourth side of Trajan's forum did not end in a temple, but with a large basilica called the Basilica Ulpia, named after Trajan's family. It was a very impressive building. The main hall was twice as long as it was wide and stretched the entire width of the forum, about 120 meters. Inside, 2 rows of columns formed side aisles around a long central nave that was 23 meters wide and 80 meters long. At both ends were large apses, partially enclosed and decorated with embedded columns. The basilica probably had upper galleries above the side aisles. The floors and columns were covered with fine colored marble, especially Egyptian gray granite. The ceiling was likely coffered and covered with gilded bronze plates that reflected light beautifully into the darker areas below. Outside, the main architectural feature was a shallow porch with 4 columns that aligned with the forum's entrance and Trajan's statue, also shown on coins. Behind the basilica was a small courtyard with 2 libraries, one on each side, and the Trajan's column in the middle. Like in many Roman complexes, the column and temple followed the same axis as the forum, though they weren't visually connected. The libraries had thick brick walls and vaulted roofs to protect against fire and moisture. Inside, scrolls were stored in rectangular niches on 2 levels, with upper levels accessed by galleries and staircases. The column itself was made from massive blocks of Carrara marble, each weighing around 40 tons. It had a square base, a shaft in Doric style, and a bronze statue of Trajan on top. Inside the base was a burial chamber for the emperor's ashes, and a spiral staircase with 185 steps led to the top. What made the column unique was the spiral frieze carved all the way up, showing detailed scenes from Trajan's 2 Dacian wars. Although hard to see at the top, the artistic detail and storytelling had a lasting influence on Roman sculpture. This idea was later repeated in columns built for emperors Commodus, Theodosius I, and Arcadius. Beyond the column was a large temple built by Hadrian after Trajan's death. It was dedicated to Trajan and his wife, Plotina. Although now buried under the Church of Santa Maria di Loreto, coins and ancient maps show that it was a massive structure. It had 8 columns at the front, stood on a tall platform, and was set against a semicircular colonnaded courtyard. A surviving column base near Trajan's column suggests the temple's columns were even taller than those of the Pantheon, weighing about 120 tons. To the northeast of the Forum, on the terraced slopes of the Quirinal Hill, were the Trajan markets, a complex commercial zone with over 150 shops and offices, plus a large market hall. The market was spread over 3 levels: a wide street next to the Forum, a middle level known in medieval times as Via Biberatica, and an upper level facing the Quirinal. The entire structure was built with brick-faced concrete and decorated with travertine. Roman architects used arch-based cells called tabernae, one-room vaulted shops with large doorways, sometimes with a wooden loft above. This design adapted perfectly to the uneven terrain. One innovation was the use of baked tiles instead of wooden frames to mold vaults. First tested in the Golden House and the Colosseum, this method became common in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. It reduced the need for carpentry, made construction faster, and allowed complex multi-level designs. This technique contributed significantly to the speed, durability, and efficiency of Roman urban architecture. The success of the Trajan markets was not just in function, but also in how they fit into the urban landscape. The terraced design followed the natural slope of the hill and allowed people to move across different levels easily. The lower level connected with the Forum, the middle level served daily shopping, and the top level had high-end shops and social spaces. This made the markets a pioneer of vertical, multi-level commercial architecture. Architectural elements were carefully chosen. Warm travertine columns contrasted with the red brick walls for a rich appearance. Interiors were covered with barrel or cross vaults. The main hall of the market served as a central place for trade and also as a public gathering spot. Arched corridors and stairways connected different levels, creating both architectural harmony and practical movement throughout the complex. Trajan's market was a unique achievement in Roman architecture, not only for its engineering, but for how it served city life. It brought together shopping, administration, social interaction, and logistics in one place. This made it a clear example of the Roman Empire's vision for architecture and urban planning. Trajan's legacy in building was not just about creating grand monuments, but about making structures that worked well for the people. The shops were mostly lined up along streets or corridors built on steep slopes, but in one part of the market, they were arranged more closely in a tighter plan. This section formed the covered market hall, a carefully designed building spread across 3 levels. On the lower level facing Via Biberatica, 6 individual shops were placed side by side. A staircase at the southern end led to the main floor above. This middle floor was a rectangular hall, 28 meters long and 9.8 meters wide, with a vaulted ceiling. On each side were 2 rows of 6 shops, smaller ones on the upper level. Visitors reached the upper shops through a corridor with a railing, which overlooked the central hall. The main vault was supported not by marble columns, but by large travertine brackets to reduce the span between supports, similar to the design of great imperial baths. Stairs connected the different levels, and there was also a second entrance from the upper street. The layout was extremely well thought out and reflected a natural flow of movement. Compared to simpler markets in Tivoli and Ferentino, this market showed how far Roman architecture had progressed since the late Republic, both in practicality and monumentality. The design was highly functional, especially in how it adapted to a difficult hillside site. But it could also be monumental when needed. For example, the 3-story facade facing Via Biberatica had sturdy travertine-framed shop fronts on the ground level, with shallow balconies above the mid-floor windows. This style became typical of the New Rome that developed after the Great Fire of 64 AD, and similar facades can still be seen in the streets of Ostia. More decorative was the semicircular facade at the lowest level, shaped to fit the outer curve of the forum's exedra. Its upper story had a row of arched windows, framed by pilasters, and a continuous entablature. Together they formed a series of shallow iadiculae, with every 4 pediments grouped in 3s, a curved pediment in the middle, and triangular ones on each side. This broken pediment style had appeared in Pompeian wall paintings 50 years earlier, but hadn't yet become standard in monumental buildings. It likely suited the plastered brick material still developing its own architectural expression. For a long time, this famous facade was thought to be part of the forum, but it was actually not visible from inside. Today, viewing it head-on distorts its proportions and detail. It was meant to be seen from the street, at an angle and from a distance. The curve of the street and the repeating elements created a rhythmic effect, suggesting length. But the full facade was never visible at once. The shallow reliefs stood out in slanted light, contrasting with the plain wall behind. Trajan's Forum and Market were built in the same period and from a single plan, but they were almost completely different in style and layout. The Forum was an enclosed monument imposed on the terrain, while the market was shaped by the slope of the Quirinal Hill and interacted with its surroundings. The Forum followed traditional design in materials, layout, and love of classical decoration. The market, on the other hand, showed the latest architectural trends and techniques. This contrast marked a time of change. The market was one of the finest examples of modern Roman architecture, while the Forum and Basilica still represented the traditional grandeur of earlier times. Today, we may admire the market more, but to people of the time, the Forum was the most impressive monument. It's also one of the few Roman buildings for which we know the architect's name and story. Apollodorus of Damascus, the architect, shows little clear influence from his Eastern background. His bridge over the Danube proves he was a top-level engineer. Even the few buildings in Rome that are definitely his reveal a wide range of skills. His work on baths and markets shows he mastered the Roman concrete technique as well as Rabirius, Domitian's architect. Rabirius may have been the more daring innovator, but both were shaped by the same architectural era. However, the Forum and Basilica were not closely connected to current trends in Rome. Their combination came from designs developed in other parts of Italy and the western provinces. This was an early sign of Rome beginning to take architectural inspiration from outside the capital. At the same time, the plan and details of the Forum clearly break from the Flavian style and return to the Augustan age. We see this in the exedras and caryatids, which were copied directly from the Forum of Augustus. Many decorative elements were also nearly identical to those in Augustan buildings. Except for practical needs like the libraries, there was also a return to traditional materials like stone and wood instead of concrete. Basilica Ulpia, aside from its two apses, was basically a larger, more richly decorated version of a building from Augustus's time. Like Augustus's architects looked to classical monuments in Athens, Apollodorus looked back to Augustus. The basilica helped preserve a fading tradition in Rome. It symbolized the empire's golden age. Although no new basilica followed in Rome until Maxentius built the last great one 2 centuries later with a very different model, the Ulpian Basilica inspired many provincial versions. It survived until Constantine's time and earned great admiration. Even though many factors led to the basilica form being chosen for Christian worship, Trajan's basilica remained a strong model in people's minds. Basilica Ulpia may not have been the most original design, but very few ancient buildings enjoyed such lasting prestige or influenced later architectural history as deeply. Trajan's death in 117 AD provides a good moment to look back at what had changed in Roman architecture since the assassination of Julius Caesar, about 160 years earlier. Although there was no clear break in architectural progress at this time, or even during the 3rd century, this period brought new challenges and new ways of thinking. The energy of Augustus's grand building program had finally begun to fade. For over a century, that program had shaped the architecture of Rome and acted as a reference for both progressive and conservative architects. Now, the focus was shifting again. Wealth and cultural power were moving away from Italy and towards the provinces. As a result, architects in the 2nd century increasingly looked outside of Rome for new opportunities and inspiration. However, some classical traditions had become firmly established and would continue for centuries. For example, the classical system of columns, capitals, and entablatures would remain a standard element of architecture regardless of time or location. Real architectural innovation would not appear again until the reign of Emperor Justinian. Even so, many other elements showed regional differences. In Italy, classical features had long been used mostly for decoration, a trend that became monumental during the final years of the Republic. Augustus also used both the Italic version of classical forms and the wider Hellenistic tradition in his own program. Domitian's Stadium was the last major public building in Rome to fully cover its facade in classical decorative elements, marking the end of a long era that spanned from the late Republic to the early Empire. These changes can be partly explained by local factors. In the example just mentioned, we see how brick-faced concrete, soon to be the most common building material in Rome, led to simpler, undecorated facades that matched the nature of the material. Decorative elements were moved more and more to the interior, onto walls covered with marble and painted plaster. Even in traditional areas, such as temple architecture or carved classical details, a clear change in direction can be seen. While Augustan monuments continued to serve as an endless source of ideas for later Roman architects, the Stadium of Domitian marked the end of an era, just as Trajan's Forum represented the final stage of a tradition going back to Augustan planning. It's telling that only one generation later, Emperor Hadrian turned to Anatolia for inspiration when building the Temple of Venus and Roma. This shift reflected broader developments in architecture. We've already seen how the new ideas about space that developed in the second half of the 1st century, such as in Nero's Golden House or the Flavian Palace, were closely tied to the arrival of new materials and techniques. In this case, the key material was Roman concrete, or opus caementicium. To understand how bold architectural thinking advanced during this time, we need to look closely at what this concrete was and how it worked. Roman concrete wasn't like modern concrete or cement that could be poured and shaped on its own. It was made by mixing mortar with chunks of stone and was usually laid down in horizontal layers, not poured. In fact, it was similar to rubble construction with mortar, but Roman mortar was much stronger. This durability is what made Roman concrete special. Although the concrete core was often covered with another material, the outer layer had little structural importance. This strong version of Roman concrete was made by mixing lime with volcanic sand known as pozzolana. This wasn't a sudden discovery, but the result of generations of trial and error. Over time, the mix, first used for platforms or city walls, became strong enough to be used for arches and vaults as well. Pozzolana is a good example of how much chance and practical wisdom played a role in architectural innovation. One of its best features was that it hardened when wet, making it ideal for marine construction. It was probably first noticed during harbor works at Puteoli, which is how it got its name. The sand was regularly shipped from there to Rome for building bridges, piers, and harbors. There were large amounts of similar volcanic sand near Rome, and by the time of Augustus, this local pozzolana was already used in ordinary buildings. Still, 50 years later, Emperor Claudius was importing pozzolana from Puteoli for his harbor project at Ostia. As the quality of concrete improved, building vaults became easier. Roman concrete had become so strong and unified that it no longer needed the traditional inner arch made of cut stones used in the Republican period. From now on, vaults could be built layer by layer, just like walls, and would stand solidly because of the dense concrete core. Interestingly, Roman architects were slow to realize how revolutionary this material could be. But once they understood its potential, they embraced it quickly. Thanks to a few surviving key structures, we can see this transformation in great detail. When Hadrian died in 137 AD, there were probably still people alive who remembered Nero and the Great Fire of 64. But in the years between, all the main stages of Rome's architectural revolution had already taken place. This revolution would become Rome's most original contribution to European art history. The first major public building to show signs of this transformation was Nero's Golden House. People at the time were amazed by its luxury and its location in the heart of Rome, more like a countryside villa. One example is the irregular hexagonal plan around the central courtyard, which was new for Rome, but already common in seaside villas of Campania and Latium. This was a sign that traditional right-angled layouts were starting to be challenged. But the real breakthrough was the octagonal room in the eastern wing of the palace. This was one of the most important spaces in Roman architectural history. For the first time, a room was designed not just with a new shape, but with a new idea of how space could be used and experienced. Even though some design problems remained, like the awkward triangular gaps between the radial rooms, these small flaws were overshadowed by the overall boldness of the design. This was truly an interior-focused architecture, where space and light were just as important as walls and stone. The focus had shifted from solid surfaces to open spaces. Structural elements like walls and vaults were no longer seen as opposites, but as partners working together to create form. Even the form itself became less clear. While the layout was centered around one main room, the eye was naturally drawn upward through the oculus in the dome or outward through the radial side rooms. The light, too, played an important role. It entered the room through slits above the dome's outer rim, lighting the space indirectly. In this room, we already see the early forms of all the ideas that would later define Roman imperial architecture. Everything was there in seed form, ready to grow and change the future of architecture. To understand how revolutionary these changes were, it's important to remember how architecture worked in the ancient world. Traditional architecture was based on placing a roof over 4 solid walls, expressing the basic need for shelter in a very direct way. Whether in Greece or the ancient East, architectural forms were shaped mostly by how stone was stacked and how parts like walls, roofs, platforms, columns, and beams interacted. Greek architecture followed a logical and rational structure, with beauty found in how familiar design elements were creatively repeated and varied. Crucially, Greek architecture was mainly external. It was meant to be viewed from outside, not lived in from the inside. Even when large interior spaces were built, like the Telesterion Hall at Eleusis, the results often felt awkward, as if aesthetics and function couldn't quite work together. This is where Rome made a breakthrough. The Romans were the first to develop a style of architecture that focused on the interior space. A key milestone in this shift was the octagonal room in Nero's Golden House, Domus Aurea. This building was the first clear and impressive expression of a new way of thinking about space, but it wasn't a sudden invention. The octagonal plan had likely been developed earlier and then quickly adapted to this site. We know that garden pavilions, decorative pools, and playful architectural designs were already popular in the villas of the Julio-Claudian period. While few of these structures survive today, we can find references to them in Roman literature and art. For example, Varro's famous aviary at Casinum. These spaces encouraged creative architectural ideas, and the Golden House likely drew inspiration from earlier villa architecture, such as the garden pavilions of Caligula or Nero's earlier palace, the Domus Transitoria. What really matters, though, isn't where the idea came from, but how many architectural ideas came together in this one building. Many of these ideas were already known in Roman architecture. For example, awareness of interior space had grown during the late Republic. This difference between Greek stoas and Roman basilicas reflects that shift. Structures like the Basilica Ulpia or the central hall of Trajan's Market can be seen as branches of this Roman tradition. Also, the interest in curved or polygonal forms was already growing during Augustus's time, and we can see this in the rich coastal villas that included fountains, porticos, and small temples. On a more practical level, these forms were also used in the construction of theaters and amphitheaters. Roman concrete made these shapes possible. In amphitheaters, for example, barrel vaults were placed radially within an elliptical plan, something only possible with concrete. Thanks to this material, architects were no longer limited by the shapes allowed by traditional stone or brick. Once a strong and unified concrete mix was developed, the shapes of walls and vaults became limited only by architectural imagination, not by materials. At this point, a new world of architectural ideas had been unlocked. By the time Nero died, that key had already been turned, and there was no going back. In the Golden House, we see not just a designer using concrete to make new spatial forms, but someone giving these forms monumental importance in one of the most famous buildings of the time, something never done before in architectural history. Once this bold step was taken, progress came quickly. We see this clearly in Domitian's large palace, built just 25 years later. The first major development was in the quality and skilled use of materials. Even if we don't count the vaulted entrance hall, the basilica's barrel vault alone was a great engineering achievement. It needed extra support soon after it was built, showing that the architect was still learning through experience and pushing boundaries. Another major advancement was the deliberate use of curved shapes and a growing awareness of how interior space could create emotional and visual effects. For example, on the west side of the official courtyard, there was a row of small rooms. On the upper floor of the residential wing, a circular room was placed inside a square plan with 2 levels of 8 small niches. On the ground floor, in the north wing, 2 domed rooms were built, one with a door slightly off-center, showing a creative break from symmetry. These rooms showed just how advanced the design thinking was for that time. The architect also made more modest but still impressive spaces, like the fountain courtyards next to the large dining hall. But the domed rooms best express his bold effort to create new, exciting interior spaces. The only thing still holding him back was the dominance of traditional right-angled design throughout the building. Apart from a slightly curved middle portico facing the Circus Maximus, the structure still looked very rigid and boxy from both inside and outside, hiding its radical interior. As curved elements were used more often, architects began using surprise and visual drama as part of the design. For instance, the diners in the Grand Triclinium would have been able to look into central and side courtyards, creating a layered experience. This idea of visual surprise and connection between spaces would be fully embraced by Hadrian a generation later in his villa at Tivoli. To imagine the power of surprise in these new spaces, just picture a visitor walking through a plain doorway and suddenly entering a tall, light-filled, nearly empty vestibule. The shock would have been part of the architectural experience. Another major area where these new spatial ideas took hold was in imperial bath complexes. Roman baths had always been a social and leisure space, and this made them perfect places to experiment with new architecture. Concrete vaults were ideal for meeting the practical needs of bath buildings. As a result, bathhouses helped spread the new architectural style across the empire. In Rome, they also played a major role in developing and popularizing these ideas. After the Augustan period, bath culture grew rapidly in both public and private life, with architecture adapting to meet demand. Among the early examples of this new style, the imperial baths stand out. Titus's baths were definitely built with concrete, and Nero's earlier baths likely were as well. These buildings were compact and functional, so they didn't feature wild curved shapes, but their large, grand interiors made them perfect for creating a sense of spatial unity through connected views between rooms. Still, in Titus's baths, the final standard layout of later Roman bathhouses wasn't yet fully developed. For example, the frigidarium was still placed at one end of the central axis. In later baths, like those of Trajan 30 years later, this room would move to the center of the complex and connect visually with all parts around it. And if Palladio's drawing of Titus's frigidarium is accurate, showing a cross-shaped hall with barrel vaults on 3 sides and a large apse closing the 4th, it suggests that even this key room had not yet reached its final architectural form. Trajan's architect, Apollodorus of Damascus, made a major innovation by replacing the side barrel vaults with groin vaults that were the same size and height as the central part. This created a new axis perpendicular to the main one and introduced a sense of directional uncertainty in the space. This effect can still be felt today in the frigidarium of the Baths of Diocletian, now the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli. In fact, Michelangelo and Vanvitelli once disagreed strongly about the axial layout when redesigning this church. This design of the frigidarium was a variation Apollodorus had also used in the central hall of Trajan's market. It became even more important in later Roman architecture. The key differences in Trajan's baths were the larger scale and greater variety of forms, especially the use of many circular, semicircular, and even oval shapes. This building set the standard for Roman public bathhouses, a type that remained mostly unchanged for the next 2 centuries. The so-called Roman architectural revolution didn't happen overnight. Its full effects and meaning would take generations, even centuries, to be truly understood. Hadrian's villa near Tivoli, deep in the Campagna, is not a building that can be easily summarized. It was the work of a restless and experimental mind, backed by unlimited resources. So it's not surprising that the villa contains such a wide variety of unique buildings. These structures all make clever use of the land's natural slopes and were built almost entirely in concrete, finished with brick or herringbone masonry. By this time, curved forms were no longer rare. They had become standard. For example, the emperor's private island retreat, known as the Maritime Theater, shows almost no straight lines. Instead, it has a circular moat and triple-ringed colonnade around a small courtyard with a central fountain, all surrounded by convex and concave rooms. The scallop-shaped layout of the courtyard reflects the shapes of the surrounding room fronts. This play between curves became even more advanced during the villa's second phase, from 125 to 133 AD. It's especially clear in the central courtyards of the Piazza d'Oro and the West Palace. The Piazza d'Oro was bordered by 8 outward and inward curving colonnades, while the Academy had a circular form broken by 4 large convex colonnade segments. Its 9 radial segments were alternately concave and flat. These rooms weren't designed to impress with luxury, but to explore new and creative interior forms. In the small baths, the architect clearly aimed to avoid ordinary design. Both the shape of the rooms and the building's overall layout, like a puzzle, show this intent. The ground floor still seems to follow a rectangular base, but the roof's layout resists rational reconstruction. The entrance hall of the Piazza d'Oro takes this idea further. Its plan is a variation from the Flavian Palace, a circle inside a square, surrounded by 8 alternating rectangular and sloped niches. These niches have arches above them and are topped by an octagonal, ribbed pumpkin-shaped vault that smoothly transitions into a dome with a central oculus. Similar designs appear elsewhere in the villa, in other baths, and in the basement of the Roccabruna Pavilion. But the real innovation in the Piazza d'Oro's entrance hall is the complete removal of the square outer frame. Now, the outer facade simply follows the shape of the niches inside. For the first time, architectural form was fully shaped by the interior plan. A major barrier of traditional design had been crossed, and a new path opened. While fully expressing these interior forms on the outside remained a challenge, the issue had at least been recognized. In contrast to the villa's experimental nature stands another of Hadrian's major works, the Pantheon. While the villa reflects restless curiosity, the Pantheon feels like a complete and confident success. Still, its design was full of challenges, both structural and visual, that had never been faced before. No other building so powerfully and clearly represents the achievements of the 60 years since Nero's Golden House. With the Pantheon, the architectural revolution became complete. Interior space was now the heart of Roman architectural thinking. Agrippa's original Pantheon was rebuilt by Domitian after a fire in 80 AD, but it was either destroyed or seriously damaged again by 110 AD. The current version was completely rebuilt by Hadrian between 118 and 128 AD. Brick stamps confirm that the entire structure belongs to Hadrian's time, with only minor repairs added later. The Pantheon has 2 main parts: the domed rotunda, which served as the temple's main room, cella, and the front porch with huge columns that once faced a long, narrow, colonnaded courtyard. When judging this facade, we should remember that people stood much lower in ancient times, and the pediment was higher than it appears today. Even so, the junction between the two parts was so clumsy that some scholars thought they were built in different periods. In reality, this wasn't a timing issue but a functional one. The porch was a nod to tradition. A temple was expected to look that way from the outside. But once you step inside, the porch is forgotten. The rotunda has a deceptively simple plan. A hemispherical dome placed on a circular drum with a diameter and height of 142 feet. Following Vitruvian ideals, the height of the dome's center matches the width of the space below. Inside, the drum is divided into two zones, outside into 3 levels by cornices. The upper part outside aligns with the bottom of the dome. The exterior is plain, but the interior is richly decorated. The lower zone has a central apse, 3 rectangular and 3 curved exedras, and 8 small aediculae between them. The upper zone features 16 evenly spaced rectangular recesses that look like windows. The dome itself is decorated with 5 rings of 28 coffers that decrease in size towards the top. These coffers were once stuccoed and probably gilded. The oculus at the top is the only light source. Whether the architect planned it or not, the 8:7 ratio between the drum's sections and the dome's coffers creates a rhythmic break that emphasizes the dome's upward movement and striking presence. The Pantheon's octagonal layout had earlier examples, like the so-called Temple of Mercury at Baiae, with a diameter of 21.55 meters, or Domitian's circular Nymphaeum at Albano with 15.6 meters. But nothing matched the Pantheon's scale. Its dome remained the largest in the world until modern times. St. Peter's Basilica's dome is 42.5 meters wide. Completing such a dome was a huge engineering feat. This success relied on 3 key elements. First, the structure sits on a massive 4.5-meter deep concrete ring, widened during construction to over 10 meters. Second, the quality of the mortar was excellent. Third, the filler stones were carefully selected by weight. While using lighter materials in vaults was already known, here the entire structure was graded, heavy basalt at the base and light pumice near the oculus. The outer shell was also made thinner near the top, under 1.5 meters, to reduce the downward force to about 2.5 to 2.8 kilograms per square centimeter. The 6-meter thick drum walls could easily support this load. Internal recesses and hidden cavities were added to reduce weight and absorb settling during drying. These voids helped prevent structural stress as the concrete dried, and they were supported by a series of visible relieving arches on the exterior. The architect wanted to avoid any cracking at all costs. These openings also sped up drying and were reinforced with tile layers placed horizontally every 1.2 meters. There is no real evidence for Piranesi's claim of a hidden brick rib structure inside the dome. The only brickwork is the 3 tile rings around the oculus. The 3 visible arches inside are part of the drum's top zone, not the dome. The lowest ring of coffers, which completes the dome's curve, is just decorative. It has no structural purpose. By the middle of the 1st century, the results of Rome's architectural innovations were clear and impressive. Buildings like Nero's Domus Transitoria already included many familiar architectural forms. Even outside Rome, before the destruction of Pompeii in 79 AD, a variety of materials were available for small-scale private use. During the Flavian emperor's reign, single-piece marble columns, once seen as luxurious features in the Julio-Claudian period, became common in monumental Roman architecture. Some of these columns were extremely large. For example, the red and gray granite columns in the Pantheon measured around 11.8 meters high and weighed about 84 tons. There were even taller examples. A single ton of marble could cover 30 to 40 square meters of flooring or 80 to 90 square meters of wall surface. So it's no surprise that Roman emperors used marble generously. At first, this new material was used in traditional ways. For example, in the Forum of Augustus, floors had colorful geometric patterns, and architectural wall schemes were designed to match classical orders. But soon, a more decorative style emerged. In Nero's palaces, we see bold, curving floor patterns and complex wall designs, showing that decoration was becoming less connected to the building's real structure. In the Pantheon, only the wall niches serve any function. The columns and pilasters in the apse across from the entrance are purely decorative, and the upper-level decoration has no structural purpose. Using classical orders just for decoration was not entirely new. Augustan architects had already borrowed this idea from the late Republic and applied it successfully in public buildings and wall paintings. Still, in older buildings like the Theater of Marcellus or temples with false peripteral layouts, the columns and pilasters reflected the structure beneath. Even painted columns in second-style wall art looked like they could support real roofs. But with the development of concrete, a new kind of building design emerged, one that could no longer be explained with traditional architectural terms. Since classical decorative forms remained unchanged throughout antiquity, interior finishes increasingly became separate from the structural system. By late antiquity, this led to attempts to visually dissolve heavy structures and create effects of light and space. Though not fully developed at the time, the seeds of this idea were already present in Hadrian's era. Among Rome's decorative materials, stucco was the least durable. It was the standard material for covering and decorating concrete vaults, but few large-scale public buildings preserve it today. What we know about Imperial Roman stucco mostly comes from small buildings that survived by chance, like tombs. For this reason, we should be cautious about assuming that the free-flowing leaf decorations in the Balta tomb beneath the Church of San Sebastiano were common in public architecture. We know of two main uses for stucco in public buildings. First, it was used to create coffered ceiling decorations, like those in the Pantheon, major bathhouses, and the Basilica of Maxentius. Second, it was applied in complex panel designs on vault surfaces. These panels were often painted or gilded and can be found in Nero's Golden House, the Colosseum passages, Palatine tunnels, Hadrian's villa baths, some tombs, and private homes. This decorative style was later adapted by architect Robert Adam, who admired its elegance. However, it likely wasn't common in the main halls of large public buildings. Both uses of stucco had roots in late Republican architecture. For example, the coffered niches in the Temple of Fortune at Praeneste, or the detailed stucco panels in the Farnesina Villa. Vaults reflect this conservative tradition. While stucco should be considered when imagining how large vaulted interiors looked, it didn't play a key role in shaping Roman architectural development. Mosaic was a very different story. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, mosaics were mostly used for garden features and fountains, sometimes for small wall panels instead of paintings. In contrast, in Rome, the rise of large vault construction and the growing popularity of luxury bathhouses, both public and private, created new opportunities. Mosaic was perfect for decorating wet bath interiors. While no surviving examples in Rome or Ostia are older than the 1st century, Pliny the Elder noted that Agrippa's baths did not have mosaics, suggesting that the practice had just recently become common. If the surviving mosaic traces in the dome of the Temple of Mercury at Baiae are original, then mosaic vault decoration must have started soon after Agrippa's time. By the end of the 1st century, mosaics were being used not only in baths, but also in theaters, palaces and villas, garden pavilions, and any richly decorated concrete vaulted structure. Many mosaic fragments still survive in Hadrian's villa, for instance, in 2 libraries, a cryptoporticus, the half-round colonnade pavilion, and the semi-dome of the Campus area. This is not the place for a deep study of vaulted mosaics, but it's important to note the distinction between floor mosaics and vault mosaics. While they sometimes shared similar designs, they were crafted by different artisans. Floor mosaics were made by tessellarii and mainly used stone or marble, with glass used only in small, detailed scenes. Wall and vault mosaics were made by musiverii and were almost always entirely glass. The curved surfaces of the vaults, the uneven textures, and the effects of translucent blue or white glass under light reduced the sense of physical mass and emphasized spatial effects. This technique only reached full maturity in the Christian era, when gold background mosaics became popular. But the foundations were laid much earlier. At first, architecture inspired mosaic decoration, but later the visual qualities of mosaics began to shape architectural and decorative design in return. The death of Trajan in 117 AD marked the end of an era. At that time, the Roman Empire was at its greatest strength, with control stretching from the River Tyne in Britain to the Euphrates in Mesopotamia. But this wave of expansion had reached its peak. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, turned away from dreams of Eastern conquest and instead focused on peace and strong governance. People living at that time might have seen this change as a result of Hadrian's cautious personality, and they would have been right. But later generations would recognize his actions as a smart response to a changing world. One of the clearest signs of this new era, in architecture and other areas, was Italy's steady decline in importance compared to the rest of the empire. In the 1st century, it was still possible, though perhaps misleading, to write a complete history of Roman architecture just by studying buildings in Rome. This wasn't just because early emperors concentrated their building efforts in the capital. It was also because Roman architects at that time made truly original contributions to architecture. As explained earlier, this creativity was rooted in the fact that Italy was still the center of the Roman world, and Rome was the heart of Italy. But now, Italy was quickly losing that privileged status. Rome still held its special place for a while, but over time, it became just the first among many powerful and wealthy cities in the empire. Given this situation, it's no surprise that later emperors were more selective in how they supported building projects in Rome. Likewise, modern scholars studying Roman architecture should also be selective. Over the next 2 centuries, many impressive buildings were constructed in Rome. But unlike in the 1st century, these no longer defined the course of architectural history. Instead, they became just one part of a much broader picture. During his reign, Hadrian made 4 major contributions to the architectural landscape of Rome. He completed and dedicated the temple of the deified Trajan at the north end of Trajan's Forum. He built the Pantheon. He constructed the Temple of Venus and Roma on the Velia Hill, and he built his own mausoleum along with the Aelius Bridge, which connected it across the river. He also repaired existing structures, especially in the Forum of Augustus and on the Palatine Hill, where some of Rabirius's bold designs needed significant restoration. Outside Rome, Hadrian spent much of his reign working on his massive country villa near Tivoli. He also invested heavily in the city of Ostia, so much so that much of what we see there today can be credited to his efforts. The Temple of Trajan and the Pantheon were already discussed in detail. Both were from the early part of Hadrian's reign. Indeed, the Temple of Trajan was probably almost finished before Trajan died. These two buildings had very different architectural goals and designs. This variety was also seen during Trajan's time. For example, the contrast between public baths and markets on one hand, and forums and basilicas on the other. But when it comes to decoration, which often reflects the skills and training of the artisans, both structures show strong continuity with earlier traditions. Despite their differences, Hadrian's early public architecture clearly followed the style of the past. This continuity makes the innovations in Hadrian's later projects even more meaningful. We don't know exactly when the Temple of Venus and Roma was started, but it hadn't been dedicated by 135 AD. This temple honored Venus, the mythical ancestor of the Roman people, and the goddess Roma, the personification of the city. It was built on top of the Velia Hill, where the entrance hall of Nero's Golden House had once stood. The temple was damaged by fire in 283 AD, and some of its key features, like the twin-domed apses and the column arrangements inside the two cella, were added during a major renovation by Emperor Maxentius between 305 and 311 AD. However, the core design, with two back-to-back cella facing the Colosseum and the Forum, followed Hadrian's original plan. The temple had 10 columns on the front and 20 along the sides, and measured 66 by 136 meters. Unlike the typical Roman style with a high podium, it was set in the middle of a flat rectangular court and raised only slightly above ground with a low series of steps. Long colonnades with gray Egyptian granite columns lined the longer sides. The short ends were left open. The 50 years after Hadrian's death were a quiet time in the architectural history of Rome. After years of ambitious building projects, the three emperors, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, and Commodus, chose to build only what was necessary to preserve the image and authority of the imperial dynasty. Military victories were still marked by triumphal arches. But for Marcus Aurelius, only a few carved panels survive. Some were reused in the Arch of Constantine, and others are now in the Capitoline museums. The column of Marcus Aurelius still stands in Piazza Colonna. Modeled after Trajan's column, it shows scenes from his Danube campaigns between 172 and 175. Like Trajan's column, it served more as a grand tomb than a triumphal monument. A similar column, slightly earlier, was built in honor of Antoninus Pius. It had a red granite shaft about 15 meters tall, standing on a decorated base. This base is now in the Vatican museums. A more important architectural duty of this period was building temples for the worship of deified emperors. Even the cautious Antonine emperors could not ignore this tradition. For example, Hadrian built a temple for his mother-in-law Matidia, and Commodus built one for Marcus Aurelius. However, we only know their likely locations in the Campus Martius. Nothing else has survived. Hadrian himself was honored with a grand temple, the Hadrianeum, dedicated in 145 AD. 11 of its marble columns and parts of the inner walls still stand on one side of the Borsa building in Piazza di Pietra. Inside, a series of flat, expressionless reliefs showing figures representing Roman provinces once decorated the cella. Some of these are now displayed in the Capitoline museums. Architecturally, the most interesting feature is the mix of styles in the entablature. Some elements, like the curved frieze, are clearly Asian in origin, while others come from classical Roman design. The clean, foreign lines seen in the Temple of Venus and Roma had now been replaced by the rich ornamentation typical of Roman taste. The foreign craftsmen Hadrian had brought to Rome were soon absorbed into local workshops. Within a decade, the decorative motifs once seen as strange had become part of the city's regular design vocabulary. The famous Temple of Antoninus and Faustina in the Roman Forum was begun by Antoninus Pius in 141 AD to honor his late wife, Faustina. It followed a traditional layout with 6 columns and a front portico on a high podium. It survived because it was later turned into the Church of St. Lawrence during the Middle Ages. The Baroque facade added in 1602 shows how much the ground level had risen by the early 17th century. The temple was originally clad in marble, with walls made of neatly cut tufa stone. The upper parts used Proconnesian marble, and the columns were covered with green Charistos marble. The decorations combined features from the Trajanic and Hadrianic periods, especially from the Forum of Trajan. But overall, the design was somewhat lifeless and academic, making the temple typical of its time, but not especially innovative. Still, this temple is important because it reminds us how much famous Roman monuments have changed over time, in their structure, appearance, and historical meaning. The cleaned and simplified forms we see today often don't reflect their original design or the transformations they underwent. Complete restorations, like that of the Arch of Titus, are rarely justified. Even partial restorations, such as the Curia, carry their own risks. In this context, the current look of the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina doesn't perfectly match any single point in its history, but it still offers a visual summary of its long journey. Fortunately, some evidence helps us imagine the temple's original appearance. For instance, an ancient coin shows a view of the temple that includes statue groups, rare features that usually don't survive. In a modern reconstruction drawing, we can see how the temple might have looked when viewed from behind the temple of the deified Julius and the Regia. Apart from Antoninus Pius's restoration of the Temple of Augustus, most recorded repairs from this era were minor. Coins suggest that this temple, originally with 6 Ionic columns, was rebuilt with 8 Corinthian ones. After the mid-2nd century, architectural interest shifted almost entirely to private buildings. These private structures are discussed in another section. Among them were new or rebuilt sanctuaries for 2 Eastern gods. One, built soon after 138 AD on the Aventine Hill, was dedicated to Jupiter Dolichonus, a Syrian god adapted for Rome. The other, built in the 2nd century on the Janiculum Hill, honored Jupiter Heliopolitanus, the main god of the Syrian triad worshipped in Baalbek. This temple is important not because of its surface resemblance to early Christian buildings, but because it shows how humble but powerful Eastern religions, like Christianity, expressed a shared idea in architecture. Most classical Roman religions were public by nature. Their altars stood in front of temples, and sacrifices or rituals were held openly for all to see. In contrast, both Eastern cults and Christianity practiced rituals that were private and exclusive. Their temples were inward-looking and carefully hidden behind high walls, away from public view. After Emperor Commodus was killed in 193, civil war broke out. It ended with the rise of a new dynasty. This dynasty had stronger connections to the Roman provinces than the one before it. Its founder, Septimius Severus, was a skilled military leader of African origin. His wife, Julia Domna, came from Syria and was the daughter of the high priest of the Baal temple in Emesa. Although Severus presented himself as the adopted heir of the Antonine emperors through a made-up adoption process, he knew that a show of architectural grandeur was necessary to legitimize his rule. After a quiet period in the late 2nd century, Severus and his successors, Caracalla, Elagabalus, and Alexander Severus, built many structures in Rome. Architecturally, the 40-year Severan era wasn't a time of major innovation, but one of solid and consistent achievement. Even so, this period marked a turning point reflecting broader political and social changes across the empire. The first task for the new regime was to restore and modernize existing monuments. Records show that Severus and his family repaired several buildings, including the Temple of the deified Vespasian, the Pantheon, probably only its decorations, and the Porticus Octaviae, whose brick pedimented entrance still stands today. Other repairs included the Temple of Peace, which had been damaged in a fire in 191, and nearby buildings between the House of the Vestals and the Temple of Vesta. One of the important results of these repairs was the creation of a detailed marble map of Rome. It was carved onto 151 slabs and placed on the wall of a hall next to the Library of Peace. Although much of it is lost, the remaining pieces offer a rare look at many ancient Roman monuments that no longer exist. This map is especially valuable because it shows detailed layouts of homes, apartment buildings, shops, and businesses, information we only know in fragments from texts and archaeology. All the building types seen in 2nd century Ostia appear on the map. Only a few older Pompeii-style houses still stood, showing just how much Rome had changed in the last 100 to 150 years. Sometimes small buildings stand out from the rest. For example, the headquarters of the Tanners Guild, the Carrarea Septimiana, is believed to date from this time and was located near the Ponte Rotto. Several large private properties were also known. One of them, the Horti Variani, belonged to Elagabalus's father and was expanded after Elagabalus's death to serve as an imperial residence. Remains from this area include a small amphitheater, a full-size circus for chariot races, a bath complex restored by Empress Helena, now lost but once drawn by Palladio, and a grand reception hall with large square windows. This hall was later converted by Constantine into the Church of Santa Croce in Jerusalem. The Amphitheatrum Castrense had a 2-story brick-covered concrete facade and looked similar to the theater at Ostia. Architecturally, it falls in a transitional period between the early Empire and late Antiquity. It doesn't fit neatly into either category, and the shift in style happened so gradually that it is almost unnoticeable. The Severan emperors were very active in building public baths. With a growing population and rising living standards, it became harder to meet the demand. A record from the year 354 lists 952 baths in Rome. Septimius Severus was known for building the Thermae Septimianae on the Aventine Hill. Alexander Severus renovated the Baths of Nero in the Campus Martius and built several smaller baths throughout the city. But the largest and most impressive of all was the Baths of Caracalla, dedicated in 216. The layout of Caracalla's baths followed the model of the earlier baths of Trajan from a century before. The main improvement was in how the surrounding area was organized. The entire complex covered 20 hectares, about 50 acres. It included water storage areas and various social spaces typical of bathhouses. The main bath block was in the northeastern section. Except for the large circular caldarium, hot room, which projected from the southwest side, the whole structure fit into a large, simple rectangle measuring 214 by 110 meters. The building followed a clear and balanced plan. It had 2 identical bath sections on the short axis and a central crossing on the long axis. At the center where the axes met stood the vaulted frigidarium, cold room, with 3 sections. At one end of the short axis was the caldarium, with a round dome slightly smaller in width than the Pantheons, but much taller. At the other end was the open-air swimming pool, natatio. At each end of the long axis were 2 identical sports courtyards, palaestrae, surrounded by terraces and colonnades. The hot rooms lined the entire southwest side, with large arched windows facing the afternoon sun. On the northeast side were changing rooms, toilets, and service areas. Hidden corridors, stairways, and galleries connected these rooms with the furnaces and water storage areas. The Baths of Caracalla represent the peak of early imperial concrete architecture. Although some design problems still existed and certain features were not yet fully developed, the building showed clear progress. For instance, the plan of the caldarium was caught between a round and an octagonal form, suggesting that bath design was still evolving. However, the large windows in the drum were an important step forward and would become more common by the end of the 3rd century. One of the key challenges of Roman architecture during this time was designing exterior facades that matched the interior space. Most of the bath complex looked like a massive block of stone, except for the southwest side. This side, with its long rows of windows and the large projecting caldarium, was both expressive of the interior and visually striking on its own. Internally, the space worked well. It was functional, but also carried deeper meaning, reflecting Roman ideals. Unlike the grand open layouts of Hadrian's villa, this building used intersecting axes and inward-facing rooms to create a sense of privacy and intimacy. Only the southwest rooms opened to gardens and sunlight. The use of colors and light was also sophisticated. The contrast between rough black and white floor mosaics, warm marble walls, and bright frescoes or mosaics in the vaults gave the space vibrancy. Light and shadow shifted across the interiors, giving depth to the view along the building's long axis. This style may seem strange today, especially because its later imitations often lacked the original meaning. But when judged properly, this architecture comes alive as powerful, creative, and a clear expression of Rome's wealth and power. The same skill appeared in the Severan building projects on the Palatine Hill. These focused on expanding the hill's southern corner. Some unfinished parts of Domitian's palace were completed, and new wings were built on large arched foundations. These huge substructures are still visible from the Aventine and Circus Maximus. Although the upper buildings are mostly lost, what remains shows that the architects were confident and economical in their use of materials. One of the most famous Severan structures on the Palatine is the Septizodium, dedicated in 203 by Septimius Severus. Though demolished in 1588 for materials, it was once a 3-story columned facade with apses and side wings, resembling a theater stage. It likely served as a monumental fountain and may have symbolized the 7 planets. Similar structures were built in Asia Minor around the same time. Another long-lasting Severan contribution was the introduction of opus alexandrinum, a type of floor made of red and green porphyry stone, first used by Alexander Severus on the Palatine. This style later became common in many medieval Roman churches. The Severan emperors also built important religious structures. Although their architecture was often traditional, the temples they built show a shift toward late antique religious ideas. Alexander Severus restored the Temple of Isis in the Campus Martius. Caracalla built a grand temple of Serapis on the Quirinal Hill. Elagabalus, known for his eastern roots, built a temple for the god Baal of Emesa and added a sanctuary for Adonis. These gods were not part of the Roman pantheon, showing both the family's Eastern heritage and the changing religious culture of the time. Even the temple Septimius Severus, dedicated to Hercules and Dionysus, had Eastern connections, since these were local gods of Lepsis Magna, his hometown, transformed into Roman forms. The exact location of this temple is unknown, and it may have been a private building. Elagabalus also built a large temple for the sun god Sol Invictus, located on the Palatine across from Hadrian's Temple of Venus and Rome. Though now ruined, remains and coin images show it was a large hexa-style temple, 6 columns across the front. surrounded by a colonnaded courtyard. After Elagabalus died, it was rededicated to Jupiter the Avenger. Caracalla's Temple of Serapis was near today's Piazza del Quirinale. Documented in the 15th and 16th centuries, it stood in a rectangular courtyard. A grand back wall with 2 staircases descended toward the Campus Martius. Its front faced uphill and, unusually, had 12 columns. The columns were about 17.66 meters high, with large capitals and entablatures. Though often said to have Egyptian influence, the design was quite Roman. The decoration, however, had a strong Asiatic style, similar to the Hadrianum. This temple's simplicity, compared to other Severan works, is notable and reflects its likely connection to the Flavian architectural tradition. The same workshops likely built both this temple and the Baths of Caracalla. 2 other Severan buildings deserve mention. One is the camp of the Imperial Guard, the Equites Singularis, discovered under the Basilica of St. John Lateran. Although military in function, it was built like any civilian building nearby, showing how military and civilian architecture were blending. The other is the famous Arch of Septimius Severus in the Roman Forum, built in 203. Its general design is traditional, but the reliefs showing Eastern campaigns adopt a new, late antique style, moving away from the classical forms seen only 25 years earlier. Many of the private buildings shown on the Severan marble plan of Rome were built recently, mostly in the 2nd century. These buildings likely helped fill the gaps left by the official building projects. For example, after a major building boom under Hadrian, brick production slowed. If private construction had not continued, this slowdown could have been disastrous. Even though some small producers left the business, there was still enough organized production and skilled labor to support large public works under the Severans. Building was no longer limited to the elite. Many new buildings in Rome and Ostia were developed or owned by a growing middle class, mainly the descendants of freedmen from the eastern provinces. These people were clever, adaptable, and active in trade, administration, and business. They built or rented luxurious homes and apartments and filled cemeteries with their tombs. These tombs, like private housing, reflected the art style of 2nd century Rome. Roman tomb architecture varied greatly. In the 2nd century, the styles were simpler, shaped by the middle class's taste. Early tombs, like those under the Church of Saint Sebastiano, were simple rectangular buildings with barrel vaults and small niches for ashes. Walls were painted or plastered, and decoration was minimal except for a small aedicula on the back wall. This simple design quickly evolved into more decorative forms. This evolution can be clearly seen in the Vatican necropolis, dating between 120 and 180 AD. As inhumation replaced cremation, tomb designs changed. Lower walls featured arched niches, while urns were placed higher up. Over time, architectural frames expanded, adding columns and entablatures, eventually becoming very ornate. The tomb of the Caetenai family is a prime example of this advanced decorative style. This decoration style was also seen in freestanding tombs outside the city. These often looked like small towers with gabled roofs. Though most interiors are lost, the tombs along Via Latina preserve decorated vaulted ceilings. Their exteriors show excellent brickwork, with pale terracotta used for trim. Some had red surfaces with white mortar lines, techniques that influenced both city tombs and functional buildings. Eventually, this ornate style was abandoned as cremation faded. By around 180 to 200 AD, tombs like that of Quintus Marcius Hermes were very plain, with just 2 rows of arcosolia. This simple, open design became typical of late Roman tombs, continuing into underground crypts and imperial mausoleums. Decoration moved to symbolic paintings, mosaics, and marble sarcophagi. No picture of classical Rome is complete without mentioning Ostia. This port city was closely tied to Rome and avoided medieval destruction, preserving many examples of classical architecture, especially houses and shops. In contrast, Rome's examples are mostly gone or buried. The following section outlines Ostia's development and main public monuments. Its modern-looking apartment buildings will be discussed later. Ostia's city plan was mostly set by the early 1st century BC, when Sulla enclosed the city with walls. These walls, forming an irregular trapezoid of about 65 hectares, shaped urban growth. At the center was the old military colony from the late 4th century BC. It had a rectangular plan with 2 intersecting roads dividing it into 4 parts. Later, city roads grew from the gates of this castrum. The main east-west street extended from the East Gate and paralleled the Tiber River. It split the eastern part of the city into 2 areas. The northeast part, between the Decumanus and the river, became public land and was carefully planned. Other areas developed along 3 major roads from the castrum, leading to Laurentum, the sea, and the river mouth. Thus, eastern Ostia was more regular in layout, while the western and southern parts were shaped by natural geography. By the end of the Republic, some key temples were already built. Surprisingly, there was no large forum, or if there was, it was very small. 2 temples from the late Republic or early Augustan era, one likely the first Capitolium, created a formal center along the eastern Decumanus, where the future forum would be located. Many of the private buildings shown on the marble plan from the Severan period in Rome were actually built in the 2nd century. These private buildings likely helped fill the gaps left by the official city-building programs. For example, after the major building boom under Hadrian, there was a slowdown in brick production. Without the strong and steady demand from private builders, this could have caused serious problems. Although some small producers had to shut down, there was still a well-organized production system and enough skilled workers for the large public projects of the Severan emperors and their successors. Construction was no longer something only the rich elite could afford. In cities like Rome and Ostia, many new buildings were developed by a fast-growing middle class, often the sons or grandsons of freed slaves, many of whom came from the eastern provinces. These people were smart, adaptable, and entrepreneurial. They had started to play important roles in trade, administration, and business. They were able to build or rent luxurious homes and apartments, and their graves filled the cemeteries of the city. While house architecture is discussed elsewhere, the tombs from this period are equally impressive and reflect the art style of 2nd century Rome in both expected and surprising ways. Tomb architecture in Rome was incredibly diverse and full of personal choices, making it hard to summarize. But in the 2nd century, this variety became more limited, mostly shaped by the taste of the new middle class. Already in the 1st century, we can see examples of simple family tombs, like those under the Church of San Sebastiano. These tombs were small rectangular buildings, vaulted and built from reticulated stonework or increasingly from brick. They had small niches inside for urns, holding cremated remains. The walls were usually painted in bright colors or covered in plaster. Aside from a decorative central niche, there wasn't much architectural complexity. This simple tomb style shows how classical simplicity could evolve into Baroque richness. Once this change began, it moved quickly. All stages of this development can be seen in the tombs of the Vatican necropolis, dated between 120 and 180 AD. A practical reason for this change was the shift from cremation to burial. To fit full bodies, The lower parts of the walls were designed like continuous bases with arched or semicircular burial niches called arcosolia. The urns for cremated remains were now placed higher up. Within this structure, classical styles began to expand and turn into repeating patterns. As aediculi spread along the side walls, they started to break up and multiply, connecting into a continuous architectural frame of small columns and entablatures. At first, these decorations were simple and consistent. Over time, they became more complex, featuring clever combinations of straight and curved shapes, concave and convex forms, plain and decorated elements. Colors and materials were also used to create strong contrasts between plain surfaces and colorful sections. The tomb of the Caetani family in the Vatican necropolis shows the peak of this development. Its decorations resemble those seen on Pompeian wall paintings or even on facades in Petra. These similarities are so strong that they suggest some influence or inspiration, but in this case, the development seems to have happened naturally and internally. It's a great example of how classical ornament can evolve when freed from strict function, something well understood by art historians of the 16th and 17th centuries. This high level of decoration wasn't limited to tomb walls in city cemeteries. These are just where we see it best. In the 2nd century, suburban cemeteries also saw ambitious architectural tombs. These were freestanding buildings, sometimes shaped like low towers. Although interiors rarely survive, one exception is the double tomb on the Via Latina, where we still find well-preserved vaulted ceilings with fine plasterwork. The exterior walls that survive show outstanding brickwork. Architectural elements like capitals, frames, and cornices were often made of pale terracotta and stood out from the rest of the walls. The walls themselves were built with carefully chosen decorative bricks, sometimes coated in shiny dark red and outlined with thin white mortar. These techniques were copied in city tombs, and simplified versions were even used in homes and practical buildings. After the 2nd century, this style of decoration fell out of use, but the tombs helped make brick a respected building material in later Roman architecture. The interior style of tombs also changed. Baroque-style decorations had become so complex that it was hard to go further. But when cremation was no longer common, these styles lost their function and were not used again. The complex systems of niches and architectural frames were replaced by much simpler designs. For example, the tomb of Quintus Marcius Hermes in the Vatican necropolis, dated to around 180 to 200, shows 2 rows of plain arcosolia in an extremely simple space. This open and minimal interior design became a long-lasting feature of Roman tombs. We can see the same in the hypogum of the Aureli, in underground tombs, and even in some later imperial mausoleums from the late Roman period. The focus moved to symbolic decorations covering every plastered wall, mosaics, or detailed carvings on marble sarcophagi. These forms became very common in the funerary art of late antiquity. No full description of classical Rome is complete without talking about Ostia. It was not just Rome's harbor city, it was also deeply connected to the capital. Because it was abandoned early in the Middle Ages, many examples of Roman architecture survived here. In contrast, most of these structures in Rome were either destroyed or buried under later buildings. This is especially true for commercial and residential buildings, which were often dismantled for materials or lost under modern construction. The following pages tell the story of Ostia's development and its main public monuments. The highly modern-looking apartment buildings will be discussed later. The basic layout of Ostia was already formed by the early 1st century BC, during the time of Sulla, when the city was surrounded by walls. Except for the seafront, these walls marked the limits of city growth throughout antiquity. the walls enclosed an irregular trapezoid shape, covering about 65 hectares. At the center of Sulla's Ostia stood the original military colony, founded by Rome in the late 4th century BC. This rectangular space, about 200 by 130 meters, was enclosed by walls and divided into 4 parts by 2 crossing streets. The streets that shaped later Ostia all led out from the gates of this castrum. The eastern gate opened to the city's main east-west street, the eastern Decumanus, which ran parallel to the Tiber River. It split the eastern part of the city into 2 rectangles. The northeast section between this road and the river was early on declared public property and planned with strict rectangular layouts. The rest of the city developed along other main roads: the Laurentum Road, heading south from the castrum, the western Decumanus leading to the sea, and the Via della Foce, which followed the Tiber to its mouth. These 3 roads left the southern and western gates and curved either left or right. So the parts of Ostia developed differently. The northeast and southeast were shaped by strict rectangular planning, while the west and south followed the natural geography. All later growth followed this basic framework. By the end of the Republic, some key religious buildings had already been built, but surprisingly, there was no real forum yet, or only a very small one. 2 temples from the late Republic or early Augustus period, one likely the first Capitolium, were located along the eastern Decumanus and acted as an early civic center where the forum would later develop. In Ostia, only a small and representative group of the many buildings that have survived can be clearly described. The most common building type in the city was the taberna, a simple one-room shop used by craftsmen and small retailers across the Mediterranean world. In its developed Roman form, the taberna was a deep, vaulted room with a fully open front. Sliding wooden panels, like those found in Pompeii, could close off the entrance. Inside, there was usually a wooden loft that served for storage or sleeping, reached by a wooden staircase and lit by a small window above the door. This simple and flexible design could be adapted easily. It could appear as a row of shops along the street or be grouped around a courtyard to form a small marketplace. These shops were also often built into the ground floors of apartment buildings, similar to modern Renaissance palaces in Rome. However, unlike in Rome, where shops were often carved out of existing structures, in Ostia they were designed as part of the building's original plan. Apartment buildings in Ostia are discussed in the next section. But even here, we can see that combining shops with multi-story housing was a practical response to rising population, land prices, and the growing wealth of the working merchant class. From ancient texts, we know Ostia was not the only port city to experience these changes. Moreover, these architectural solutions were not limited to housing. The courtyard apartment design was also used for fire brigade barracks, clubhouses for professional guilds, or tall storage buildings for commercial goods. State-run grain warehouses, which already existed in the 1st century, had also evolved to include ramps instead of stairs to reach upper levels. In the imperial period, only 3 temples in Ostia stood out as important public monuments. One was the Temple of Roma and Augustus, from the time of Tiberius, which served as the center of the imperial cult. Across from it, in the expanded part of the forum, stood the Capitolium Temple built under Hadrian. This temple, made of brick but covered in rich marble, was built on a tall podium to rise above the nearby apartment blocks. The third was a large round temple with 10 columns in front, dating from the late Severan period, though we do not know which god it was dedicated to. As expected in a port city, Eastern religions spread quickly in Ostia. While their temples were not architecturally impressive, a large triangular complex housing the temples and rituals of Cybele, Attis, and Bologna is a rare example that shows the typical layout and features of such cults. At least 3 bath complexes in Ostia were large public baths, all built with imperial support in the first half of the 2nd century. The Baths of Neptune and the Forum Baths are especially important. The Baths of Neptune were a logical development of the central baths seen in late Pompeii. The bath complex stood along one side of a rectangular colonnaded exercise yard, with shops on its street-facing front. The Forum Baths had a bolder design. A rectangular cold room was followed by warm rooms with polygonal or curved shapes, arranged along the southern wall to get the most sunlight through large windows. This free and functional design was very similar to the Heliocaminus baths at Hadrian's villa. Right across the street, there was also a well-preserved public toilet. In the 4th section, we discussed the new architectural ideas and how they appeared in major buildings in the capital, such as the markets of Trajan. Now, we see how those same ideas were reflected in the everyday buildings of 2nd century Ostia. In terms of planning, the answer is simple. Population growth and rising land prices forced buildings to be planned more tightly and efficiently. The clearest result of this was the trend toward building taller. It became normal to see shops with flats above them, apartment blocks 3 to 5 stories tall, and commercial buildings with 2 or 3 floors. Describing the visual changes is harder. One major trend was the move away from traditional elements that no longer made sense in concrete construction. Instead, builders began to see brickwork on the outside as a design feature in itself. This shift moved architecture away from using columns and toward creating identity through a pattern of full and empty surfaces. The introduction of window glass played a big role in this. In city architecture, walls, doors, and windows became the main tools for visual expression. These changes did not come from strict ideology, and old styles were not abandoned overnight. Traditional features remained in specific areas where they were still meaningful. Marble colonnades, for example, were still used to show grandeur in temples, monuments, and bathhouses. Inside buildings, both public and private, classical column styles were still used for decoration. However, in everyday structures like apartment courtyards, shop fronts, and street arcades, simple brick piers and arches replaced the usual columns and beams. Street facades looked modest but confidently modern. In Ostia, the impact of new Roman architecture is most visible not in palaces or temples, but in the daily lives of ordinary people. This shows just how far Roman design had advanced in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and how some of its key ideas have remained influential to this day. One of the most striking things for modern visitors in Pompeii is how complete the city feels. But something less obvious is that in AD 79, Pompeii was still recovering from a major earthquake that happened 17 years earlier. Only a few public buildings had been fully repaired. Many were still damaged or under construction, including most of the Forum. Much of what we now see in the ruins was actually built in the last 15 years before the eruption. This is part of what makes Pompeii so unique today. In contrast, earlier changes over the previous 50 years had been more modest and followed long-standing local traditions in Campania. The houses in Pompeii and Herculaneum have strongly influenced how people today imagine Roman daily life. A closer look at Herculaneum suggests that if the city had survived for a few more decades, it would likely have developed its own version of the apartment buildings we see in Ostia. In fact, many older homes had already been divided into smaller units, and upper floors were becoming more common. Buildings like the Porticus Tulliana near the Forum in Pompeii, with their arcaded streets, show that some architectural trends from post-Nero Rome were already appearing before AD 79. Still, The typical house style of the late Republic, with an atrium and peristyle, was dominant. But the most noticeable changes were not in the architecture, but in the styles of wall painting. The second style, which used illusionistic architecture, was giving way to more purely decorative patterns, unrelated to real space. The city's reaction to changing times is much clearer in its public buildings. What happened in Pompeii was not unique. Similar developments were taking place across small towns in Italy and the provinces. Most towns were expected to have a standard set of public buildings. In this way, Pompeii offers a perfect example of municipal architecture in first-century Italy, mixing traditional and new ideas, republican and imperial styles, and old and new building techniques. Just listing Pompeii's public monuments is informative. Apart from small household shrines, the city had 9 temples. 2 of them, the Doric Temple in the Triangular Forum and the Temple of Apollo, were from early periods. 3 others belonged to the late Republic: the Capitolium, the Temple of Jupiter Melicius, Gentle Jupiter, and the Temple of Venus. The Capitolium was at the head of the Forum and served as the main religious center for the Roman colony that Sulla established in 80 BC. The other 4 temples were built after the Republic and reflect the spirit of the New Age. The Temple of Fortuna Augusta, built in 3 BC, and the Temple of Vespasian were linked to the imperial cult. The Temple of Isis, supported by a private donation, shows the popularity of Eastern mystery religions in Campania, especially through connections with Puteoli. These 3 temples show 2 strong trends in religion at the time. First, the official state religion focused on the emperor and deified leaders. Second, the rise of mystical faiths that addressed people's personal spiritual needs. It's notable that the Temple of Isis had been fully rebuilt and decorated before the eruption. The 4th structure tied to imperial religion was a public lararium, a sacred place for protective gods, built soon after the earthquake as a way to bring unity. Other public buildings, like the Basilica, the City Council Hall, Curia, its offices, and the Comitium for voting, were gathered around the Forum. All of them dated from the Republican period. The same is true for the city's entertainment buildings. The open-air theater was built during the earlier Samnite period, before Sulla. The amphitheater and covered theater were added after Pompeii became a Roman colony. Other Republican-era buildings included the Samnite Gymnasium and 2 of the city's 3 public baths. In the last century before the eruption, several new structures were added. These included the vegetable market, Forum Holatorium, a grand palaestra with colonnades and a swimming pool, and the headquarters of the Wool Workers Guild, the city's most powerful trade group. This last building was located near the Forum and was built during the reign of Tiberius by the priestess Eumachia as a gift to the guild. It foreshadows the important role such guilds would play in places like Ostia in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The palaestra, from the Augustan period, replaced the older Samnite gymnasium near the theater. It was unusual outside of Campania and has been described as a Hellenistic gymnasium without a bath complex. In Rome, this kind of space was usually part of a large public bath, where open courtyards and swimming pools were included. But since Pompeii's baths were located in busy central areas, a Greek-style solution made more sense here. To complete the list of imperial-era public buildings, we should also include the Forum itself. Its tough stone colonnades and floor were being rebuilt in travertine after the earthquake and were still unfinished in AD 79. This shows that public spaces, like streets and squares in old Italian cities, often developed slowly and in parts. Still, even with this slow progress, Roman town centers gained a kind of unity and beauty that can be compared to medieval cities. It also shows how active the town governments were, and how refined the architecture could be in expressing civic identity. Almost all of Pompeii's public buildings were heavily damaged in the earthquake. The two most important ones, the Capitolium and the Basilica, were still ruins in AD 79, likely waiting for full rebuilding efforts that never came. Other buildings like the Temple of Apollo and the Amphitheater had been repaired only in part. The theater and the Forum Baths had reopened for limited use, while many other buildings were still under construction. Builders reused whatever solid parts they could from older structures, but when finished, many buildings would have looked completely new. Looking at all this, we can see that in its final years, Pompeii had largely adopted the same construction methods used in Rome. However, it was more cautious about adopting the newest design ideas. The reuse of old materials led to some creative and temporary solutions. Brick was the main material in new buildings. But unlike in Rome, where buildings had large windows with brick arches and lightning arches above, as seen in the central baths, Pompeii's homes and shops still mostly used wooden beams. One important lesson from Pompeii and Herculaneum is that wood was still widely used in everyday architecture in smaller Italian towns, more than we usually think. Surviving ruins mostly show stone public buildings, so they don't reflect this. But in fact, many door frames, beams, balconies, roofs, and even upper stories were still built with wood, just like in Republican Rome. The upper seating of the theater, which had been rebuilt under Augustus, was still ruined in AD 79. But the stage building had been redesigned after the quake, with alternating rectangular and curved niches and recessed aediculi, in line with more complex contemporary theater designs. Another monument shaped by current trends was the building of Eumachia. Its basic layout was simple: a rectangular courtyard with colonnades. But the facade that faced the Forum had two shallow curved niches for decoration. The side colonnades ended in small apses, and the main axis ended in a large apse surrounded by two columns. The marble doorway and the sequence of triangular and curved pediments in the wall panels were reused from the original structure, built under Tiberius. These same features were copied in the nearby Temple of Vespasian. Among the buildings in Pompeii's Forum, the most clearly modern one is the Lararium. This structure has an open courtyard with vaulted rectangular niches on both sides. At the far end of the courtyard is a large apse, and within that is a smaller, shallow apse. Two small rectangular niches sit diagonally across from this central apse, and an altar stands in the center. The walls include architectural elements like pilasters, recesses, and raised platforms. Although not fully vaulted, the design was clearly inspired by central plan vaulted architecture seen in the capital. Similar wall niches and shallow platforms appear in the city's curia. These probably supported shallow aediculi made of plaster or veneer marble. This technique became a standard way of decorating wall surfaces in later Roman architecture. Nearby, the brick supports in an adjoining hall had a functional role. They were designed to hold wooden cabinets for storing city records, known as the tabularium. Another example of modern architecture in Pompeii can be seen in the Macellum, or meat and fish market, located next to the Forum. It had a rectangular courtyard surrounded by a colonnade with offices at the back and a circular pavilion, tholos, in the center. This plan is similar to one used in Lepsis Magna, in modern Libya, in 8 BC. A similar building found in Morgantina, Sicily, from the 2nd century suggests that this design likely originated in southern Italy and spread to North Africa, Greece, like Corinth, Asia Minor, and Rome. In fact, an older Macellum north of the Roman Forum had a central tholos before 27 BC. The Macellum Livii on the Esquiline Hill and the Macellum Magnum built by Nero on the Caelian Hill had similar layouts. The market building in Pompeii had 3 rows of one-room shops, tabernae. One row faced inward toward the market, while the other 2 opened onto nearby streets. Using valuable street fronts and courtyards for shop space became common in both public and private buildings. As cities grew and land values rose, this became a natural development. This practice was common in Pompeii's final years and became a key feature of Ostia's architecture as well. Another impressive example in Pompeii is the central baths. If they had been completed, they would have been the most modern building in the city. Shops lined both street-facing sides of the complex and opened onto a large rectangular exercise courtyard that took up over half the area. On the third side were offices, and on the fourth, the bathrooms themselves. This simple and functional layout was similar to the design of a traditional Hellenistic gymnasium. The brickwork was entirely modern. The main facade had half columns and large square windows arranged in a strong and elegant pattern. Inside, the warm room had alternating curved and rectangular niches that covered much of the walls, adding energy and rhythm to the space. Curved niches with doors and windows were an innovative feature. Together with the still partially buried suburban baths in Herculaneum, the central baths show what Roman architecture might have become if the eruption had been delayed by just 25 years. Do the imaginative architectural elements in Pompeii's final wall paintings reflect a lost decorative style from real architecture? That question isn't easy to answer. Artists often exaggerate and stylize, and smaller art forms don't always follow the same rules as large-scale architecture. Still, thanks to better excavation methods in the last 50 years, we now know that many painted features were based on real, three-dimensional buildings. For example, if a painted facade shows 2 wings ending in broken pediments, it's likely that this feature existed in actual architecture at the time. Considering artistic exaggeration, many delicate column-like supports, leafy capitals, rails, pergolas, and other decorations seen in third-style paintings may have mirrored real porches, balconies, windows, sun terraces, gilded wall ornaments, curtains, and fabric coverings in villas of the wealthy, especially in places like Baiae and Rome. Some unique parts of the third style may have come from other sources. Vitruvius mentions decorative ideas by Apaturius of Alabanda, a Greek architect, and others were possibly inspired by the fantasy architecture in Ptolemy IV's royal ships. The luxury palaces of late Hellenistic rulers likely influenced this style, but that doesn't mean these foreign ideas reached Pompeii directly. Such influences were probably absorbed in complex and indirect ways. Just as we can trace the Hellenistic elements in second-style painting to actual Roman buildings, many third-style motifs likely came from local architectural traditions too. Once again, we are reminded that most of what we know about ancient architecture is based on surviving skeletons of buildings, missing their decorative flesh. Pompeii and Herculaneum are valuable not just for the buildings themselves, but for the rare clues they provide about architectural styles that would otherwise have been lost forever.